Just a little hand clap for me. Everybody. Yeah. Welcome back. Come on, DRJ. I am so excited to be here. Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much. Good morning, DRJ, and welcome to Disaster Recovery Journal 2022. I am Vanessa Mathews, Chief Resilience Officer of Asfalis Advisors and the host of the Business Resilience Decoded podcast, co-owned by DRJ and Asfalis. This week, I am here as your MC for this conference. So to connect with me, to access the Business Resilience Decoded podcast, and to download free crisis management downloads for any business going through any crisis in any industry, feel free to scan that QR code. So I want to welcome you guys to our first event since fall of 2019. This is our 66th conference with more than 350 attendees, speakers, exhibitors, totaling about 500 registrants. So I'm super excited to be here. And we'd like to give a huge thank you to all of our sponsors, and thank you guys for allowing us to bring you this awesome event year over year. As I prepared for this week, I received multiple calls from three types of clients. One client was in retail who was frustrated about his unknown and known risks within the supply chain. Another customer was in financial services who's concerned about cybersecurity. And another client was in local government who was concerned about the local impact of the Russian and Ukrainian war. And as I drove around last night going to dinner in the Uber, I thought about the privilege that we have currently. The experience in this very moment in Ukraine is quite different. There's no food. There's no water. There's no electricity for the people who are left behind. And for some of them, there's no access to medication. Over 85% of critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector in the United States. Those were key targets in the Russian invasion. So as I pondered this reality, I thought about what are our clients in financial services, in retail, in local government? And for those of you who may be in critical infrastructure, are we really ready? Similar to the pandemic, we're in a global crisis, and I'm not sure some of us have realized it yet. So some questions I have for you before we get into today, and you can take this and write this down. What do I really want to get out of this conference? I looked through all the sessions. We're going to learn a lot of information. But how do I take what I'm getting and apply it to the world that we're in? Second question for you. Why am I here? Why am I here? Third question for you. Why am I really here? And then the fourth question I have for you is, why am I really, really here? And it's the really, really here that we want to get to. So I have some things for you to consider and tips for engagement. So if you're like me, I'm socially awkward now. Thanks to COVID, I don't know how to interact with people, so please be patient. The power of spontaneous conversations in the hallway. I forgot what that was like. The sound of chatter and people talking while you're talking. Forgot what that was like. Body language, facial expressions, audience reactions, standing ovations, applauses. Forgot what that was like. And getting dressed from head to toe. I forgot what that was like. So some things for you to keep in mind is all of us have a different perspective and an approach to social distancing and to masking. Doesn't really matter what you believe, just understand. I might give you a hug if I've known you. If I don't know you, it's a fist bump or an elbow bump. Don't be offended. Some of you may reach out to shake a hand. I'm not shaking hands, so don't be offended, okay? Everybody in this room, let's appreciate where everyone else is at, and let's make sure that we can respond to how other people may approach us while we're in this still pandemic. Also, DRJ is thrilled to be back in person. And just like you, they're a little rusty too. So if we can help them and support them, but also to be patient with people as we all navigate this new environment that we're in. So a couple of announcements for you. I would like to recognize a group of dedicated professionals. If you are on the DRJ Executive Council or Editorial Advisory Board, can you give us a wave so we know who you guys are? Thank you. I also want to take the opportunity to share a couple of DRJ programs. We have the DRJ Academy. It's a great place for newcomers to get skills to develop in this field, as well as the DRJ Free Mentor Program. It's a 10-month program that works with newcomers and pairs them with seasoned professionals, matching them with technology, goals, and a network of support. You can find out more of that program at the DRJ booth in the exhibit hall. From a logistics perspective, please feel free to go to the help desk for support or help that you may need during this conference. Hashtag DRJ Spring. So if you are sharing and posting on social media, please use the hashtag DRJ Spring. We would love to be able to call you out, and you might win a prize if you could use the hashtag for us. And we also have a lot of great speakers that are going to be talking throughout this week. And for you to submit your questions, does everybody have the CVent app on their phone or electronic device? Perfect. You can reach that for your program updates, messages, and to ask questions. If you're not aware, I'm going to give you a 2-second tutorial on how to submit your questions through the CVent app. So number one, go to the app and go to schedule. Secondly, select a specific Keynote session on the app, and then scroll to the bottom of the session page on the app. Once you do that, select Live Q&A, then enter your question, and you must add the session in order to access the Q&A section. All right, now that we got all the business taken care of, now it's time to hear some great speakers. So I'm very, very excited to introduce this morning's first speaker, who is going to be Raven Solomon. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her before she comes on stage. Our first speaker's life changed when at the peak of her sales leadership career with one of the world's largest CPG companies, she woke up in an ambulance. She had fast-tracked her near-decade career to an executive-level role at just 28 years old. Come on, millennials. Leading large, multi-generational teams across all degrees of difference. In an instant, her diagnosis with epilepsy changed it all. This diagnosis sent her searching for healing, fulfillment, and an even greater sense of purpose. That ultimately led her to the stage, this stage, to not only lead and influence people, as she enjoyed so much in her corporate career, but to help others lead and influence people, and to do so inclusively. She currently graces 50 to 60 stages a year on one simple mission: to help organizations get future ready by understanding generations, racial equity, and their intersection. When she's not speaking, she's advising and hosting the Generational View podcast, a podcast dedicated to cross-generational dialogue about important topics that impact society, culture, and the workplace. You may find her consulting with Franklin Covey in the area of unconscious bias, playing with her darling niece and new nephew, traveling the world, or scouring through the world of dating apps for every other millennial who thought prolonging adulting was a good idea. As you've probably figured out by now, you are in for a treat. So get ready. Let's give a warm welcome and a round of applause for an informed, energized, and more importantly, to help you move to action. Raven is going to be speaking on why be an inclusive leader, the clear business case for prioritizing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Let's give her a round of applause.
Good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. How are y'all? Excellent, excellent. We're going to try that just one more time. How are y'all? There we go, there we go. I'm going to tell you about the bar that I've set for you mentally, okay? I get to do this across the country all of the time, and I've been maybe in, I don't know, maybe 10 states since the year started. I've talked to the farmer cooperatives, I've talked to bankers, I've talked to laboratory scientists, and I can tell you that there are some audiences that give just a little bit more energy than others, right? The bankers, if I'm honest, right? The laboratory scientists, it's even worse. It's even worse. I'll just be honest. The farmers, though, I got to tell you, they came with the energy, okay? The farmers really bought the energy. So my question in my mind at this point is this community, the BC community, the risk management community, all the things, the BR community, do y'all have a little bit more energy than the bankers? Please tell me you've got more energy than the bankers. Do you have more energy than the farmers, though? Because the farmers brought it. I'm just telling you. So the bar in my mind is set really, really high. I'm just saying. If I could have my volume up just a little bit, that would be amazing. So today I'm here to talk to you about a topic that some can find uncomfortable, right? A topic that some can find a little bit intimidating, a topic that some honestly try to avoid. So I want to first give you a little bit of kudos for coming into the room, because I know this subject is one that's a little bit touchy from time or two. But I tell you, with every degree of certainty in my body, that this is a conversation that everyone in this room needs to engage in, regardless of how it makes you feel. Because at the end of the day, we are business operators, we are business runners, right? We are managers, we are leaders of people. And so as I talk to you about the changing demographic in this country, and quite frankly across the globe, I think you're going to walk out of this room thinking differently about diversity, equity, and inclusion. That it's not just a nice to have, it's also not a topic that we can afford to ignore, but it is an absolute business essential. So my job here today, we potentially talking about how to be an inclusive leader, giving you some tools, giving you some of the what. But I never, ever, ever engage with an organization or engage with an audience if we have not had really clear understanding of the why. We have to first be bought in and committed to the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion before I can talk to you about the how, right? And so today, we're really gonna talk about the clear, the undeniable, the indisputable business case for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work. So we've got a lot to go through today. I'm going to breeze through, but what I want you to do before we get started, if you will, is just take a deep breath with me. This breath needs to come through your nose and out of your mouth, and it needs to be elongated through your nose, and you got to elongate it out of your mouth, okay? Can you do that with me? All right, here we go. On the count of 3, you're going to breathe in through your nose. 1, 2, 3. Let's do it one more time. 1, 2, 3. Excellent, excellent. I want you to know this is a safe space. I want you to know that I may make you feel uncomfortable. In fact, I will. That's my job. But I want you to lean into that discomfort. Because I guarantee you, if I presented any other, or really any, let's call it, if I presented any business challenge to you today, no matter how uncomfortable it made you feel, you would lean in, you would engage, you would push through that discomfort, and you would figure out what it is that you needed to do to solve that business problem. I want you to think about this in the same fashion, okay? I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm just here to tell you what's coming. And hopefully that'll lead to you thinking differently about what to do, okay? Let's hop in to this conversation we've got going on here today. When I do this work, I typically come across 6 types of folks. We call them just 6 different personas as it relates to the strategic change necessary to really become an inclusive organization. I'm going to tell you about these 6 types of folks, and as I do, I just want you to think about which one of these personas best describes how you came into the room today in relation to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. This is self-reflective. It's a point where you and I are honest with ourselves, because that's the best place for me to start, right? And then you're going to self-identify. internally, right? Not gonna ask you to tell anybody that, but then I want you to tell us all by filling out a poll really quickly. So if you've got your cell phones, get those out and put them on the table because we're gonna utilize those in just a moment. So the 6 personas of folks that I tend to come across when I do this work of diversity, equity, inclusion. Number 1 are the folks who are simply opposed. These folks are anti-difference, anti-inclusion. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to talk about it. They see diversity and inclusion as simply a waste of time. They find themselves sabotaging the work, whether that's subconsciously or consciously. They just don't want anything to do with it. So do you fall in that category? Rhetorical question. Rhetorical question. Second persona are the folks who are worried. These folks say, hi, Raven, I've heard about this stuff, and quite frankly, I think it impacts me negatively. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to engage it. I don't want to confront it. So these folks see diversity, equity, and inclusion work as a problem to be managed. As a problem to be managed. They worry about how it impacts them and or those that they care about. Does that best describe you? Persona number 3, these folks are just unaware. They don't see diversity and inclusion at all. They say, Raven, I don't know what you're talking about. What does this stuff even mean? This alphabet soup that you put up on the screen. And so these folks don't see diversity and inclusion at all. Does that describe you? And then we move on to the folks who find themselves to be fatigued. These folks say, Raven, I was once really, really passionate about this work. I once really, really cared, especially in 2020, right? I was concerned, but I haven't seen progress. I haven't seen any change. And so at this point, I'm just fatigued. I'm tired. I once had high hopes, but I just don't anymore. So these folks see diversity and inclusion as a pipe dream, something that will never happen. Does that describe you? Moving on to persona 5. These folks we call supportive. They say, Raven, you don't even need to tell me about the business case. I understand it. I believe that diversity and inclusion is the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do. It's just not my job. Right? It's not my responsibility. So I'm here to listen, but I'm going to take this back to the organization and I'm going to say, we need a chief diversity officer. We need a director of DEI. Right? It's not my responsibility. And then we come across folks who are absolutely committed. Persona number 6. These folks say, Raven, I understand the value. I understand this is important. It's the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do. It's the common sense thing to do. And I realize that it's not just the CDO's responsibility or the CEO's responsibility, but it's my responsibility as well. So these folks really see diversity and inclusion as an opportunity, as a must-have, and they see it as their responsibility. So think about these 6 personas, and now I want you to let me know which one of them best describes you. Pull out your cell phones, and you're going to open up your text messaging app, okay? Whatever app you use to text your friends, colleagues, family members, kids, grandkids, all the things, open up that app, and you're going to text me at this number, 22333. That's the phone number. I know that's kind of odd. 22333. That's the phone number you're going to text me at. And that's right up at the top of that screen, by the way, as well. Now, the text message you're going to send me to that number is Raven Solomon 155. No spaces, capitalization doesn't matter. Raven Solomon 155. All right, so you're going to send that text message, and what's going to happen is you're going to get kickback from me welcoming you to our chat room today. And then I want you to answer the question in full transparency. Which of these personas best describes you? You're going to respond with A, B, C, D, E, or F. That's it. That's the whole text message, okay? A, B, C, D, E, or F. There we go. We've got a couple of millennials in the room who figured it out quickly. Just joking. Just joking. I'm joking. All right, so you got it. Most of you are figuring it out. Keep going if you haven't figured it out just yet. I just want us to reflect on this really quickly. About a third of us totally committed. These are the folks that say, I get it, I understand it, and I understand that it's my responsibility as well as everyone else. We've got about a third of folks who say, I'm supportive, Raven, I get the value, but it's not my responsibility. We've got a couple of folks who are fatigued, almost 20%. Is that 20%? Yes, almost 20%. And then a couple of folks who are worried and a couple of folks who are unaware. So here's the thing. I'm really, really happy to hear there's no one opposed to the work. That is good news, because sometimes that doesn't happen. If you are worried, I don't know that I can get you all the way to committed in an hour. Right? I hope that I can, but I don't know. So my job, hopefully, is to perhaps move you 1 or 2 steps up this continuum. I want to be realistic. If you're supportive, I think I can get you to a place of being committed today. If you are fatigued, hopefully I can get you back to a place of being committed as well. But I think this is important because it allows us to be honest with ourselves. And then it allows me to know where we are as a collective, so then I can approach our conversation today appropriately. So thank you for that. I appreciate your honesty. Let's start by really laying a foundation, by establishing a common understanding of some very important, critical diversity, equity, and inclusion terms that we use in this space. Right? Let's do it. Diversity. Diversity. What is diversity? How do you define it? When I ask this question, I literally get, a myriad of responses. But I'm curious. I don't know if you feel comfortable yelling out, but I would like for you to, if anyone has a definition of diversity that you would like to share. Doesn't have to be long, doesn't have to be glamorous, but how do you define diversity? Yes, sir. A variety of opinions. What's your name? Tim, you hit it right on the head. A variety of opinions. Anybody else have a different definition you would share? How you define diversity? No one. All right. What was that? Blend of cultures. I like that as well. Thank you. Anyone else? Blend of personalities. 100%. Anyone? Can I tell you what the answer is? Oh, go ahead. Blend of ages. You all are hitting it on the head. At the end of the day, believe it or not, all diversity is, simply put, is the presence of difference. That's it. Hard stop. So the idea that some folks, particularly those of a majority community, don't have anything to do with diversity is just merely not true. Diversity is the presence of difference. It's not the presence of LGBTQIA plus folks. Right? It's not the presence of black folks. It's not the presence of women. It is the presence of difference. And so we all fall into this conversation of diversity. But folks will say, well, Raven, why is it that we only talk about certain differences when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I said, that's a great question. The reason why we talk about certain differences, like the ones you see here on the screen, is because what we know factually from a data standpoint is that these are the differences that tend to yield outcome disparity within many organizations and within our country, and quite frankly, within our world in many cases. And so in other words, these are the differences that make a difference, right? And so yes, we talk about gender identity. We talk about racial identity, ethnicity. We talk about education level. We talk about sexual orientation and disability, et cetera, because these are the differences in which the identities, the dimensions of diversity in which we see outcome disparity. Right? Now, I want to talk to you about inclusion because oftentimes we use the term diversity and inclusion interchangeably, but they're really, really different. Right? If diversity is the presence of difference, then the way that I describe inclusion is simply making sure that difference counts. Making sure that that difference counts, right? And so diversity is more about representation. It's more quantitative. Inclusion, on the other hand, is far more qualitative. It's really about engagement. It describes the extent to which the folks that you work with, the folks that work for you, the folks that you work for, feel as though their differences are welcomed, appreciated, valued, respected, and leveraged in pursuit of organizational outcomes. So it's not just about having difference present. It really is about making sure that that difference actually counts, that that difference is actually engaged, right? Vernee Myers, who is a veteran in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, she currently runs DEI for Netflix, says it this way, and I love it. She says, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Two completely different things, right? It's one thing to be invited to a party. It's a completely different thing to be asked to be engaged in that process, to be asked to dance with somebody, right? Can you imagine this room being filled with folks like us, having a party, loud music blaring, we're all standing on the wall, a couple of folks are dancing, and we're just waiting for those folks to invite us to be a part of the party? Can you imagine that? Is that a trigger for some of you? You remember high school when you were on the wall? I know, I'm sorry, I apologize. Didn't mean to do that. You remember what that felt like. It was miserable. No one wants to be in your organization, hired, go through your onboarding process, go through all of the rigorous processes to be a part, and then not actually be engaged in the organization, not actually have their skills, their talents, their difference utilized in pursuit of the organization's outcomes. And so I ask you rhetorically, are we having parties in our organization and not asking folks to dance? Only you can answer that. If we are, we have diversity, but we do not have inclusion. Equity. Let's talk about this term, because this term can get folks kind of riled up sometimes. Sometimes folks have a challenge wrapping their head around the concept of equity. Sometimes folks use the word equity and equality interchangeably. But they are two very, very different words, and I want to help you understand the difference, if you don't already know, and perhaps help you articulate this difference in further conversation somewhere else. Now, going back to our definition of diversity, the presence of difference, right? We all agree. Inclusion is about making sure that that difference counts, right? Equity is really about ensuring that difference is accounted for. Ensuring that difference is accounted for, right? In the way that we execute our processes and our procedures, in the way that we write our policies, in the way that we distribute access to resources and opportunity, right? In the way that we do business. It's about ensuring that different experience is accounted for in the way that we do all of these things. And so to really understand and solve for inequity, you've got to understand the root cause of the issue, because it calls for you to address that root cause in order to remove the outcome disparity. So let me walk you through this imagery that you see here on the screen to help you really understand the difference between equity and equality primarily, but also just understand how you describe equity. So let's look at that top left-hand corner image. What does this tell us? Let's look at the status quo. What this says is that from its inception, lots of our organizations, and certainly our nation, and even our world, was structured in a way that benefited some more than others. That's undeniable. The stats say it, history says it. And in order to really solve for inequity, we have to understand that, we have to acknowledge it. So from its inception, a lot of our organizations, certainly our nation, and even the world, were structured in a way that benefited some more than others. Hence, the slope that you see in that foundation that everyone's standing on. Now, as everyone in that image seeks to see beyond the fence, i.e., they seek to realize this American dream that we talk so much about, as you see, the person who benefits least from that structural slope, their view is impeded disproportionately because of it. And so equality is about recognizing that and saying, I'm going to fix it. I realize we have a problem, so I'm going to give the same exact resource to everyone. And that ought to do it, right? While that absolutely lifts everyone a little bit, and it definitely impacts the person who was once really, really disproportionately impacted by that slope, it does nothing to close the gap in access between communities, between the three folks that you see here on the screen. And so equity is about recognizing that and saying, you know what? Instead of trying to give the same exact remedy or resource to every community and every person, what I really need to do is give resource according to need, not just across the board. And so equity really is about distributing based upon need to create fair access, fair opportunity. And so some folks, again, will struggle with equity. And they say, well, Raven, this seems like a handout. This seems like a charity case. This seems like unfair treatment, right? It seems like you're taking from me to give to somebody else. I want to address that. And I love imagery, as you can see, right? I put images all up on the screen, cartoons and all the things. But I think these images help us understand this so very clearly. Equity is not about taking from one and giving to another. What it is, again, is giving the right resources based upon need. It's also not a charity case. And it's also not unfair treatment. When folks will come to me and say, well, Raven, going back to your image, that person has 2 blocks. One of them has none. How is that fair? We have to understand the foundation. We have to understand the history of our organizations, of our nation, and of our world to better understand why certain groups need certain resources in order to create fairness, parity, right? Not disproportionate support. And so, to folks who say, well, that's unfair, Raven, I always say that fixing unfairness is not unfair. Fixing unfairness is not unfair. It may feel unfair, but the fact is that it's not. But it calls for us to acknowledge a certain degree of history. Let me give you an example of an equitable practice, right? Because folks will say, well, Raven, I heard you, I get it, but I don't write policy. I don't write procedure within the organization. How can I contribute to equity? I don't know what to do. Let me tell you about one organization way back in the 70s, how they changed one policy and really implemented gender equity throughout their organization. It was the Boston Symphony Orchestra back in the 1970s. And at some point they realized that women were severely underrepresented in first chair positions within their organization. And they said, hey, we want to fix that. So they brought together this meeting of the minds, and this meeting of the minds came together, and they searched through all of their policies and their procedures, and they looked for the slope in their foundation, right? And they tried to find, what's the reason for this issue? Why are we not selecting women? Are women just less talented? What is going on? And within that meeting of the minds, they decided that they were going to institute a new policy to do blind auditions going forward. And so what they did is they put up a sheet in between the auditioning musician and the judges, and they thought, surely, if the judges can't see the gender identity of the person auditioning, then this ought to be based solely on merit, talent. And so they changed the policy. They went through an audition season, and they came back, sat down at the table, and they audited their results. What happened? What do you think happened? What was that? Men were still overrepresented. There was no change. Most organizations in this moment would do what? They would stop. Yeah, they would stop. They would say, hey, Raven, we tried this diversity thing. Sorry, we're pulling funding. We gave it 2 months. We brought you in once. What do you want us to do? We got other things to spend money on. But not this organization, not the Boston Symphony Orchestra. They went through that audition season. They came back and they saw no results. And they said, we've got to figure this out. And so they brought back that meeting of the minds, gathered them around the table again, and said, we got to figure this out. They combed through their policies. They combed through their procedures. They looked through all of their documentation, their selection process. They did all of the hard work. And in the middle of this meeting, someone randomly yells out, the shoes. And I can imagine that everybody was just like you, like, what? What are you talking about? What are you talking about, the shoes? What the person went on to explain is that they believe that the judges could still tell the gender identity of the auditioning musician, because if it was a woman, 9 times out of 10, she was wearing high-heel shoes on this important date. And so when she entered the stage, you could hear the click-clack of her high-heel shoes, indicating her gender identity. And what happens is the back of our brains, the primitive part of our brain, where our subconscious lives, i.e. our unconscious bias living there as well, is triggered when we hear those high-heel shoes. Right? And so they changed the policy again, and they said, not only are we going to do blind auditions, but we're also going to require all auditioning musicians to remove their shoes upon entering the stage. Yeah, sounds silly, right? Sounds silly. Now, to be anti-equity would be to say, there's nothing wrong with my shoes. I'm not taking my shoes off. Why? I didn't wear socks today. Why would I take off my shoes? But no, the gentlemen didn't do that. They obliged and said, you know what? If I win the first chair position, it's because I'm actually a better musician, so I'll gladly take my shoes off. And so they went through the second audition season after this new policy change. They came back to the table, they audited their results, and what do you think they found? What do you think happened? They began to see women in first chair positions rise within their organization. Why do I tell you this story? I want to demonstrate that at any level of the organization you sit in, you do indeed have the power to contribute to equity. You do. But it requires a certain degree of commitment. Because after the first time, it might not work. But just like the Boston Symphony Orchestra, you got to come back, audit the results, do it again, and see it through. It also takes intention. It also takes courage to change the policy, because I guarantee you, when you change a policy for the sake of equity, there are going to be some folks who are not happy. So it requires you and I as leaders to have the courage to say, here's what we stand for as an organization, here's what our values say, and here's what we're going to do as a result. So that takes courage. And then it also takes audit, right? You got to audit the results. So folks will say, well, Raven, this diversity stuff is counting heads. We have to count. We have to measure, because what gets measured gets, nobody knows the same. What gets measured gets done. What gets measured gets done. Absolutely. Here are a couple of other examples of equitable policies, equitable practices, equitable procedures all around us that we just don't think about as perhaps being equitable. Think about curb cuts. Everybody familiar with curb cut? They exist everywhere we go across the United States. Curb cuts were created specifically for a community that utilizes wheelchairs, right? Specifically for that community, to give them fair access to sidewalks, to buildings, etc. That's an equitable policy created specifically for a community to give fair access. And we all use curb cuts, right? We all benefit from curb cuts. We have strollers, buggies, all the things, even when we just don't feel like lifting our leg up to 3 inches to get onto the curb. We all utilize curb cuts. Same thing for closed captions, right? Closed captions were created specifically for a community who's hard of hearing to give fair access to information. But we all use closed captions at some point in time or another. We all benefit from closed captions. So these are all examples of equitable policies, equitable practices, et cetera, that exist to give specific support to an underrepresented or marginalized community. Oftentimes, you and I have the privilege of not thinking about these things because we don't utilize wheelchairs. And we aren't hard of hearing. Supplier diversity is absolutely an equitable practice as well. It exists to give a specific underrepresented communities in business fair access to procurement opportunities, fair access to contracts, right? And so equity is critical to diversity and inclusion work. Without it, we really cannot create inclusion. Last definition I want to give you is belonging. Diversity, presence of difference. Inclusion, making sure that that difference counts. Equity, ensuring that we've accounted for difference in the way that we do business, the way that we do what we do. And then belonging is really about making people feel all that I just described. That is really, really hard to measure and also really, really hard to attain. I'll be honest. Let's move on. I want to talk to you about, now that we've got a foundation of some key terms, I want to talk to you about the evolution of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and then the business case around this work, right? Here's the thing. DEI work is absolutely changing. folks. It is no longer the check in the box that it used to be. It is no longer something we do when we get in trouble as organizations. It is no longer a nice to have. It's an imperative. It is a must have. And at the end of my presentation, I think you'll understand that. It's something that should be fully considered and integrated throughout every part of your organization. The optimal state of inclusion is what we call integrated inclusion. That's where inclusive policies, equitable policies, and procedures are implemented across every function of the business. Right? Every function of the business, from HR to marketing to suppliers, et cetera, supply chain, et cetera. And so it is an absolute critical aspect of business going forward, and I'll explain to you why. Let's talk about the history of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. As you can see, there's a continuum. It started way back in the 60s, right? Some of us were absolutely around in the workplace. I know I wasn't, unfortunately. Some of us were around in the workplace and remember the 60s and 70s where diversity in the workplace was just all about compliance. Right? It was all about equal employment opportunity laws. It was all about eliminating job discrimination. You did it because you had to. You did it because you needed to avoid getting in trouble with the law, right? And so in the 70s, that changed to really being more about affirmative action. Affirmative action was the thing that drove our goals, right? And the way that we approach diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so it was primarily about getting people in the door from a diversity standpoint and counting heads, making sure we weren't in trouble. And then we moved into the 80s. Well, it was more than just about getting people in the door. It began to shift to talk about how we get people into the management levels of our organization who are different, who have historically been on the outskirts, on the margins of our organizations, institutions, society, et cetera. And then we enter the 90s. And in 1990, the Harvard Business Review released the first study affirming diversity as not just a thing we should do because of the law, but really as a business value generating opportunity. And so we finally began in 1990 to talk about the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion work. In 1990. And the title of that article, if you're wondering, or that review, is called From Affirmative Action to Affirming Diversity. The first article ever written about the business value of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again in 1990. Now here's where I'm going to push you a little bit. You do realize it's 2023, right? Is it 2023? It's 2022. Is it 2020? What's the year? 2022? I live in the future, y'all. I live in the future. My goodness. 2022. 2022, right? It is, right? Yeah. It's 2022. The first study done on the business value of diversity, equity, and inclusion was in 1990. By all accounts, now my math is a little spotty. I did go to public school. That's like 30 years. And you do realize this is the first time, at least from my understanding, at this conference, we're talking about the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're behind. We are behind, 30 years behind, quite frankly. So we've got to play some catch up, right? As a practice, as an industry. And I'll show you the data. The data says this. And so I applaud us for beginning the conversation. Now we got to play catch up. Now we have to really put the foot on the gas so that we can compete as an industry in the future, because the war for talent is happening real time all around us. And we know this to be fact, right? It's hard. And so when you think about where this industry is as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, being so far behind, we've got some catching up to do in order to really compete for the best of the best of the best in terms of talent. And so in the 2000s, we finally began to shift the conversation from diversity to then talking about inclusion. Not just about mere representation, but really talking about the experience of those who are of difference inside of our organizations. And now, in the late 2010s and now early 2020s, we are talking about equity because it's absolutely essential and critical. So in short, right, companies doing the best DEI work are really seeing results because they're not just talking about this business case deal. They really understand that this is just right and it's smart. They're moving from a place of not just doing it from a legislative standpoint, but really doing it from a voluntary standpoint, right? Less because it's a mandate, more because it's a movement. Less because it's a mandate, more because it's a movement. And so we've gone from a place also of just being reactive to a place of being proactive, not waiting until we get in trouble as organizations to begin really putting our dollars where our mouths are as it relates to employee experience, consumer experience, and the value of difference. Right? It's critical. Why don't we take a look at a couple of organizations who fell into this kind of reactionary space and then learn the value of being proactive as it relates to this work. Anybody remember this? This was back in 2018. It really wasn't that long ago. This is a global clothing company that shall remain nameless for the sake of our exercise today, who thought it was a good idea to release this ad of a young black boy. Can you read what his shirt says? It says, "Coolest monkey in the jungle." Hard miss, right? And so the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, just the value of diversity at this point, having been in that room when we were thinking about the model, we were thinking about the shirt, we were thinking about making this a public product, if you will, or a public ad. Imagine had there been difference present at that table to provide perspective and say, you know what, this probably is something that we want to avoid. This is what their board looks like. You can see how that can happen then, right? Now, obviously, I know that the board is not making decisions on the model that wears the shirt and then what we put online. I get that. But if the board is any reflection of management, leadership, then we understand how that was a clear miss. Let's talk about the impact. Q1 of 2018, this particular organization had $4.3 billion in unsold clothes, which was up 7% from the prior year. Their operating profit dropped 62%, all as a result of the public outrage around that particular ad. Let's look at another one. You can probably guess who this is, but don't tell anybody. It's a beverage company. Read the banner at the top of that page. Can you see it? Should I read it for you? Raise your hand if you need me to read it for you. Okay. At the top of that banner, it says, "She's seen more ceilings than Michelangelo." Unnecessary, inappropriate, problematic, a whole bunch of other things. Do you think there were probably enough women sitting at that ad table when they made that decision? Probably not. They paid for it. Let's look at another example. This is a health food company who decided it would be a good idea to run this ad promoting their healthy food options. Can you see the issue with this? Yeah. Perpetuates a stereotype. It's offensive for those who utilize wheelchairs to say all we do is sit here, eat, consume, etc. It's a problem. And so this is the value of diversity. When I think about managing risk and really setting up infrastructure to ensure that our businesses are able to survive turmoil and issues and threats, this is critical. Having this mistake inside of a marketing agency that supports your business is a risk. It's a huge risk. Let's talk about a tech company by the name of Basecamp last year. Do you all remember this scenario? Ultimately, the CEO banned societal and political discussions at work. Right? He eliminated committees and groups that were organized to support and combat any social or political issues outside of the organization. He pretty much said it's a major distraction. It zaps our energy and redirects our dialogue towards dark places. It's not healthy and it hasn't served us well. So everybody, we can no longer talk about social and political issues at work. That's a perspective, right? It's a perspective. You know what happened? He lost a third of his workforce the next week. They all quit. We talk about the cost of attrition, right? A third of your workforce gone within days. Sure, it was a stance to take. It just wasn't the right one, right? And so if you look at, these are real live tweets that I pulled off of the Twitter accounts of these folks who decided that they were going to part ways with that organization. And if you look at the replies, you see the replies, like 150 replies, 185 replies. I clicked into those and I wanted to read what folks were saying around them. You know what a lot of them were? Job offers. A lot of them were job offers, saying, you exhibit the values we want within our organization. Come work for us. Come work with us. So the competitive landscape, folks, is tremendous. There are more opportunities now for especially really, really strong Gen Z talent, that if we're going to compete, we have to know what they care about and position our organizations accordingly. Last thing about the maturation of DEI work, we've really gone from a place of it being, again, quantitative solely, to a place of it being more qualitative. It's not just about having difference present, but it's about how that difference experiences your organization, your products, how you go to market, etc. Let's talk about demographics, because they are changing, folks. They are changing. And if we voluntarily choose not to pay attention, we are voluntarily putting our organizations at risk. And if that's a language that anybody should understand, it's the folks in this room. So demographics are changing, and so are expectations. Let's talk about it. What we really see is 4 mega trends happening within the global marketplace as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let's talk through them. Trend 1 is really all about the diversity of markets all across the globe. So what we see is an emerging middle class all around the world. Folks who were once a part of said lower class have matriculated up into a middle class status, if you will. And what that comes with is more buying power. And so now, this middle class that we all have marketed to so fervently over the last 100 years has grown more and more and more diverse, because communities and pockets all around the world that once could not necessarily engage in the marketplace now can. And so we have growing middle class, which is diversity of markets, that is then driving a diversity of customers. And not only is that customer becoming more and more diverse, but that customer now wants a certain degree of customer centricity, a certain degree of personalization. We like personalized experience, right? Of course we do. I went into my hotel room right down the hall. Well, it's not right down the hall. Actually, it's way on the other side of campus. By the way, it is a very long walk. Just saying. No, I'm joking. I'm getting my steps in. So I go in my room, and I turn on the TV, and it's so beautiful. It says Solomon Family. And I felt really special. I'm like, oh, this is my room. They cared enough about me to personalize this. I think I might just come back. I get to go all over, and I travel all the time and go to different hotels. And there was this one hotel I was at here in Orlando. I'll tell you the name, but don't tell the Disney folks. It was phenomenal. They had this toilet, y'all. First of all, you walk in the bathroom, and then the toilet just rises for you. And then it lets out this mist and all of this smell good as you walk in. I know, I'm reliving. It's okay. So all of this mist, they release, right? And then the toilet, does all of the necessary cleaning. We'll leave it at that. You know what I mean? Of you. It was incredible. It was incredible. But what I noticed on the side of the toilet is that they had user memory. And so not only does it do all of this, and it automatically flushes and all the things, but it remembered me. And it remembered, and it warms too, by the way. Oh my gosh. It was phenomenal. So this is the type of personalization I now expect, right? When I go to any hotel, I want the toilet to remember me, to warm itself to my body temperature, to cleanse me in the right way, all the things, right? So we have these high expectations of the products that we buy and whom we buy them from. And that is no different than the consumer that we see matriculating up, if you will, this certain class rank that we have across our world, and now having more buying power. So if we're going to position ourselves to meet the interesting, dynamic needs of a really, really diverse consumer, then we need to diversify our talent. Trend number 3 is always all about the diversity of ideas. What we know is that ideas are coming a mile a minute. A mile a minute. Everybody has an app idea. Raise your hand if you have an app idea. Exactly, like half the room has an app idea. Everybody has an app idea. So in order to compete, we've got to generate and ideate and innovate at a much, much faster rate than we have in the past. And what we know is that diverse communities, diverse groups of people, and remember, diversity is the presence of difference. So different communities, right, generate the best of ideas as it relates to innovation. You can have a homogeneous group, looks the same, acts the same, talks the same, walks the same. Or you can have a different group, a heterogeneous group, right? What we see is that the heterogeneous groups create better ideas. Let's talk about this diversity of talent really, really quickly. These are the living generations that we have amongst us in the US. There is a generation that is younger than Gen Z, younger than the age of 8 years old. Right now, we call them Gen Alpha. That may change. But for the sake of our conversation today, we'll just call them kids, right? We'll just agree that they are kids and leave them at that. We've got the greatest generation, currently over the age of 97, traditionalists between the ages of 76 and 96. We've got boomers, 57 to 75, not to date you by any means, if there are any boomers in the room, sorry. Gen X, 42 to 56. We've got millennials, currently between the ages of 26 and 41. That is right, millennials are grown adults. They are not the kids ministry, right? And then we've got Gen Z, currently between the ages of 9 and about 25 years old. I want to do a quick poll. Pull that phone out again. You don't have to retext Raven Solomon 155, all of that. All you do is open up that text thread, and now you can just type A, B, C, D, or E. Which generation is the largest living generation in the US? From your perspective, based upon what you have read or know or think or believe, which generation is the largest living generation in the US? All right, so leading the way is boomers, 42%. Second, a close second, well, just changed. All right, close second, Gen X, followed by millennials, and then 5% of us say Gen Z. Can I tell you what the answer is? Yeah, I'm gonna tell you anyway. As of 2017, the largest living generation in the US is Gen Z. Those who are between the ages of 9 years old and 25 years old. They surpass millennials, they surpass baby boomers. There's some sources that are gonna say it's millennials. They go back and forth, quite honestly. It's actually Gen Z. It's actually Gen Z. Why do I tell you this? Because Gen Z is also the most racially and ethnically diverse generation we have ever seen in the US. How is which one possible? Yeah, well, maybe we call it attrition, but, folks, folks transition to other parts of experience, if you will, but no, it really is because of death rates. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, most racially and ethnically diverse generation the U.S. has ever seen. Also, when it comes to diversity, the value of diversity, seeing it as a good thing for society, we really see that millennials and Gen Z think very, very similarly about this very thing. Right? And so we know that it's valuable to them. Here's what I always like to point out as it relates to kind of the generational experience of, if you will, of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Gen X came into the workforce right around the time where it was really about diversity. We had talked about affirmative action for quite some time, and then we started doing this diversity movement thing. We finally started to talk about the value of difference across the organization, up and down, all levels. And then millennials came along and they said, hey, it's great that we have difference present at this table. That's wonderful. But some of the folks of difference at this table actually don't have a voice. So what good is the diversity? What we really need is inclusion. They were right. And now you have Gen Z coming into organizations and saying, hey, it's really great that you've got difference at the table. That's cute. Right? It's also good that everyone at this table has a voice. That's also cute. But some voices are still much louder than others at this table. Some voices are still marginally suppressed and oppressed. So some of the folks at this table actually need microphones to even be at the same level in terms of volume. So they're saying we need equity. It is what they're asking for. It is what they're demanding. And then they said, while you're at it, we want to make sure that we feel as though we belong. Let's do a quick poll. Again, I want to know what generation you identify with. What generation do you identify with? A, B, C, D, or E? Which generation do you identify with? We got a lot of millennials in the room. Awesome. Lots of Gen X as well. Really, really cool. 20% boomer. Almost a quarter boomer now. All right, we're figuring it out. 30% millennial. He said it, not me. He said you're slower to get to the phone. I didn't say that. He said that. Tim, he said that. So look at the mix here. Put this in your mind, because I'm going to go to the next slide and show you what the U.S. workforce looks like, or at least in 2015. Keep this in your mind. 40% Xer, a third boomer, about a third millennial. Tiny, tiny bit of Gen Z. Look at 2015, right there in the middle. Boomers were about a third of the U.S. workforce, almost a third. Millennials as well. Xers as well, really almost an even, split between the three. Couple of traditionalists. Look at 2025. This is a forecast, right? What we think will look like the U.S. workforce. May not be, but nonetheless, we anticipate Gen Z by 2025 being almost a quarter of the U.S. workforce. Look back at the slide that I just showed, our little metric, our graph. It was maybe 2% of the room is Gen Z. They're about to be a quarter of the U.S. workforce, so how are we going to compete for that talent? Speaking of Gen Z, this is my last poll for you. A, B, C, D, or E. According to Gen Z, what is the biggest problem their generation faces today? According to Gen Z, what is the biggest problem their generation faces today? This study was done back in May of 2020, by the way. It's a couple years ago. What is the biggest problem your generation faces today? Almost half of us say climate change. 20% say older generations. That's always funny to me. 20% roughly say politicians and government. 20% say racism and discrimination. Can I tell you what the answer is? I'm going to tell you anyway. First two columns are Gen Z. Last column is millennials. The study is done by a company called Y-Pulse, and ultimately they just ask this question every year to try to get a pulse on how young people are experiencing society. The number one answer is racism and discrimination. Why do I tell you this? Again, because if you're going to position the organization and the industry to meet the needs of this talent, you got to understand what they're thinking about, what they're concerned about, what's keeping them up at night, and how you address it, because they care, and they're holding you and I accountable to it. Look at this. 51% of Gen Z say that they respect a company more if that company supports racial equity or racial equality. 77% of Gen Z workers said a company's level of diversity affects their decision to work there. So when we talk about business continuity, we talk about business resilience, and your ability or inability to manage the loss of talent, This matters, 77%. Also, when we talk about money, which is always a good topic, Gen Z is willing to spend 30% more on the same exact item when the company that they're buying for, the brand they're buying from rather, supports a social cause that's important to them. 30% more. Lastly, look at that buying power. Tremendous buying power, $143 billion. I have a podcast. And on my podcast, I, last season, talked to communities of Gen Zers over and over and over again. I would suggest checking that out because they're going to tell you verbatim what they're looking for. But I was having a conversation with one of them, and I said, how do you make your buying decisions? How do you determine what you buy and what you don't buy? And one of them talked to me specifically about this app that you see here on the screen. She said, I'm in the store, and I pull this app up, and it lets me pull up any category I want. I go to the category, and I look through the manufacturers. I look through those who I can potentially buy from. And the app will show me how they spend their money from a political standpoint. And if their politics align with mine and what I care about from a social standpoint, that's what I buy. I said, for everything? She said, yeah, for everything. I said, even toilet tissue? Obviously, I'm obsessed with like toilets and stuff. This is embarrassing, quite frankly. But nonetheless, she said, yeah. And I said, really? She said, absolutely, because I vote with my dollar. And so there are plenty of apps or sources that Gen Z is using, a lot of them here on the screen, to make decisions about how they purchase, who they vote for, if you will, with their dollar. Who made statements in 2020 about racial equity? What have they done? How have they lived up to said statement? These are the questions they're asking in interviews, by the way. And so it's important that we understand what the expectation is and can meet that need. They are the generation of cancel culture, if you want to call it that. Some folks call it consequence culture. Some folks call it accountability culture. At the end of the day, they're holding us as organizations, institutions, and structures of power accountable for what we say and doing what we say we're going to do. This I found interesting. It's the reasons why companies get canceled. Check this out. Because cancel culture is a risk to your business, a critical risk. Look at why companies tend to get canceled. This is what we should be thinking about, right? And then perhaps making some decisions around. I'm going to speed through this opportunity as we come to a close. Here's the thing. Generational diversity and inclusion drives decision-making, which then drives performance. There's a study done by a company called Clover Pop. They looked at 300 business decisions over the course of about 2 years across 100 plus business teams, and here's what they found. They looked at younger teams, which was a team that had a median age of 35 years or younger. They found that those teams made decisions that met or exceeded expectations 62% of the time, which is great. And then they looked at older teams, and they found that those teams having a median age of 45 or older made decisions that met or exceeded expectations 44% of the time. Now, we can clearly draw a distinction between this and say, oh, well, younger teams make better decisions. That's not what this is saying, right? You can assume that the older teams were probably making more high-level strategic decisions that carried more risk. Easy explain away. Here's what we can't explain away, though. They looked at the age range, and they found that teams that had what they called a wide age range, meaning they had 25 years or more between the youngest person on the team and the oldest person on the team. Those teams made decisions that met or exceeded expectations more than twice the amount of times as either younger teams or older teams. What does this tell us? That generational diversity and inclusion drives decision-making, which then drives results. I don't need to tell you this. We've been looking at data upon data upon data about the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion to organizations for decades. We've seen profitability go up based on ethnic and racial diversity and gender diversity. We've seen how teams perform better in the midst of inclusive leaders, not just diverse teams, but teams led by inclusive leaders. We see the impact of bias, where team members are 3 times as likely to withhold ideas, 3 times as likely to go look for other employment, 3 times is likely to be disengaged. We see the data time and time again. We know that teams of difference perform better, even though it takes them longer to get to a place of norming. We see this in the data. We know that diversity benefits not just the organization, but it benefits you as a leader, it benefits society, it benefits the organization and the team. When it comes to your industry, I really want to push home these three things. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is your job. As you look to manage risk, create business resiliency, make sure that business continuity exists and is strong within organizations, it is your responsibility. Not doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work authentically is a risk to business continuity. It's a risk to your industry if we're not developing young talent and getting them in this door, right? And really preparing our organization. I want to leave you with some data from BC Management. Thank you, Cheyenne, for sharing this with me. 77% of BC professionals identify as Caucasian. Less than 4% identify as being of African descent. 33% are women. Opportunity. I'll leave you with this one, which I found so poignant. Look at business continuity today, the one I've kind of outlined in red. Look at 2015 on the other end. Your industry, from a generational standpoint, the diversity of your industry as it relates to generational looks more like 2014 than it does today. We got to sit in that, and we have to succession plan to make sure we're doing it differently, because we're thinking about the future. We have to engage the future. So my question is, what are you going to do about it? You can continue to do things the way that you've done them. Sure. Or you can take a pause. You can change your policies, your procedures, the way you do business, the way you go to market. Switch out those wheels. Will it cost time? Yes. Will it cost resources? Yes. But imagine how smoothly that wagon's going to pull when those wheels are rotated and we're using the tools of tomorrow. That's my challenge to you. I thank you so much for your time. I'm going to hand it back to Vanessa, and she's going to give us our instructions for what we do next. Thank you.
Woo. Thank you, Raven. Quick notes. First, I want to say, Raven asked a question about a microphone. So I'd like for you to write down a question. When you were starting your career, who gave you a microphone? Who gave you a microphone? Who enabled you to elevate your voice? Second question I have for you to write down is, who are you giving a microphone to? So if you haven't checked yet, if you scan this QR code, we were able to have Raven on the Business Resilience Decoded podcast twice in February. If you scan this code, you can get access to one of those recordings now. While we have a lot of speakers, we do not want you guys to congregate the stage so you guys can meet Raven outside. We will have a 10-minute break. And please also check the CVent app to participate in the session notes. This helps DRJ to plan forward and to also get your feedback for future programming. We'll see you back in 10 minutes. Thank you for the break. Needed that. Get a little stretch, get some more coffee. I am curious to see where everybody in this room has come in from. So can you give me a round of applause if you traveled from anywhere outside of the United States to get here? Okay. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for coming. If you traveled from the West, so from Colorado over to California, up to Washington, give me a round of applause. Awesome. Nice to see you here. What about the Northeast? So PA, Maryland, Delaware, Jersey. Okay. The Northeast is in the building. Midwest, North Dakota, down to Kansas, Michigan, Illinois. Okay, rep your state. Southwest, from Arizona over to Oklahoma, down to Texas. All right. And what about the Southeast, from Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, Louisiana, down to Florida? Awesome. So I'm excited to introduce our next two speakers for our general session, Tracey Rice and Erick Anez. With more than 20 years of experience in business continuity, Tracey Rice is an accomplished industry leader and an all-around personality. Like, if you have not met Tracey, you are in for a treat, all right? She is really excellent in what she does in building relationships with leaders and enterprise organizations across the globe. As a Senior Vice President of Customer Engagement at Fusion Risk Management, Tracey brings customers together, partnering with them to develop innovative solutions and to achieve new levels of program success. She manages Fusion's community engagement program and speaks regularly across the world. She also serves on several industry boards, enjoys mentoring and giving back to the community, and she was awarded BCI America's 2017, 2018, and 2019 Personality of the Year. That's awesome. It speaks to who she really is. Erick Anez is a proven leader with more than a decade of experience leading change and transformation in the operational resilience field. And just so you know, today was the first day that they actually met in person, so we're quite surprised at how tall he is. So I'm super excited for these two. He focuses on operational learning, culture, and reputational management. He holds a Bachelor's of Emergency and Homeland Security, Graduate Studies in Security and Disaster Management. He's a certified business continuity professional, certified risk management professional, graduate of the FEMA Institute in Incident Management and Command, and he's a respected member of the public-private partnerships within the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, as well as FEMA. So please join me in welcoming these two to the stage to speak on From Reactive to Proactive, Making Operational Intelligence Actionable.
Thank you. It's a lot to live up to, Tracey. I don't know.
Seriously.
So before we get started, though, can everyone see me? Good. And by the way, this is not a debate session. Don't let the podiums fool you. Tracey and I are not going to go back and forth on the same topic, right, Trace?
We're not going to go back and forth. Absolutely not. No. But it seems like Erick has taken the control because he's advanced my slide already. So good morning, everybody. And I know we're live streaming today. So good afternoon and good evening to those who may be tuning in from around the world. It's really fantastic to be back at DRJ. It's fantastic to be here in person. Last night was just so fun reconnecting with so many of you and getting to meet so many new faces. So thank you for making the effort. Thank you for coming out and supporting DRJ. And we really hope that you enjoy our session and enjoy the conference as a whole. So my first DRJ was back in 1999. And so I feel that I'm one of the oldies now. And let me tell you, it looked really different back in 99. First of all, I was a lot younger. But second of all, the industry was so different back then. I mean, let's think about the sessions that we attended and the topics that we focused on. So much has happened over the past 20 years. And here we are today, and I want to kick off this session today talking about the trends that we're seeing now and how all of us have had to adapt to be able to do our job in this industry and be part of the evolution of the industry. So let's take a moment and think about advancements. Let's think about the internet, technology, innovation. What would we all have done going through a COVID situation 20 years ago? We didn't have the technology to be able to support a work from home type of model. We didn't have the innovation. Frankly, we lived our lives very differently back then. Who remembers traveling to a customer site or a show and plugging in to dial-up to download their email? Right? You still remember that noise as it was downloading? You were connecting.
You want me to recreate it? I could.
Go ahead. That's it.
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
I knew we'd have fun up here. So, I mean, so many advancements in the technology. And, you know, when you think about it, it's how we live our lives is completely different today. We're not so patient, are we? At least I'm not so patient, right? We want products, services, goods like that. We're also not so loyal as we used to be because we have more options. And so as our companies are operating on a day-to-day basis, we need to think about who our customers are and what they're looking for in terms of receiving products and services. And how loyal and how patient are they going to be? So when we think about it, the market drivers are really, really high. The pace of innovation is really, really fast, and we can't be left behind. Today, we talk a lot about operational resilience. That was a word that wasn't used 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, because the game has changed. We're not here to do a BIA, build plans, and test the plans. That's not what it's about anymore. We need to be agile, we need to be flexible, and we need to be proactive as opposed to reactive. And our jobs as practitioners, as program leaders, it's never been more important to our company. We are part of providing key insights. We're part of providing insights and information into making key business decisions. Never has this industry been so in the spotlight. And so I want all of you to think about that and think about the opportunity that that presents to all of us. It's an amazing opportunity. So we're going to do a little Menti poll. And I did see the last session, and I thought, oh, I should have used that polling. But pick up your phone, take a picture of the barcode. It'll take you straight into Menti. We're looking for some feedback on how you would rate your program today. If you can't scan the barcode, you can go to menti.com. The code's 49 44 07 13.
Those are some really good points that Tracey just made. And I want to tell you guys a quick story on how we ended up here today, right? So about 8 years ago, I transitioned from the banking world into high-risk operations, transitioned into liquefied natural gas, utility, oil and gas world, right? And one of the things that I remembered vividly was my first fatality incident investigation. And I remember that vividly for a multitude of reasons, right? Aside from the horrible events of that day, two things stuck out to me. One was how a good chunk of the organization actually put blame on that terrible event on the individual that did not make it home to his family that day, right? That I carry with me into every investigation, every event learning that I go into. The other was how, as I talked through people and trying to figure out how this incident happened, was how they could not tell me what was different about that day than any other day, right? There's this quote that I highlighted in big letters in that investigation report from that person's supervisor that said, it was a normal day until it wasn't, right? And those are what sparked the journey into trying to figure out why we're managing resiliency as an outcome to achieve rather than a capacity to build, right? So that put me down the journey into looking into human and operational performance, trying to figure out how we can build systems in place that can actually prevent that from happening. Not preventing failures from happening, but giving the organization the capacity to fail safe, right? So when things go wrong, we're managing the organization's capacity to perform within that failure, right? And it's really the preamble to a lot of the things that we're going to walk you through today. So let's see what
unfortunately,
responses
I'm
are
seeing
coming
the
in.
results,
Nobody
but they're
else
not
is.
projecting onto the screen. I don't know if our tech team at the back can share what's on my screen so everyone can see the results, or I can tell you. So 72 folks in the room said their program needed improvement. And that was the most popular answer, followed by my program is consistent, followed by just in build-out mode. And last but not least, we have 21 companies out there who say their program is industry-leading. And so hopefully the sessions at DRJ and Erick's experiences will be useful to you today and will be useful to you in actually outlining. I think we've lost it. If you come back to my PowerPoint on the screen, I think that's it. Thank you. In outlining some really great suggestions and approaches to move your program to the next level. I think this is a really great slide, the journey from reactive to proactive. Many times I talk to customers and they say to me, oh, I'm managing it all with, Word and Excel. And I say, wow, really? How do you scale that? Well, we didn't really think about that. So we started building it out in Word and Excel, and it looks really great. But now that we're in maintenance mode, there's no future for this. There's data all around your organization, your sites, your people data, your vendors, your tech, your application, your processes. Centralizing that data is building the foundation for a really great program. And bringing that data together and then mapping out all of those dependencies, giving you a visual for the connectivity, that's when we really start to get rolling with our program. And that's what we need, right? As we go through this evolution and this journey, we need that data to be live. We need it to always be the most up-to-date. We need to be able to see the day-to-day operations of how our company functions. I'm not talking about planning or responding. I'm talking about day-to-day operations. When you have a true picture of those operations, then you can react to any type of event because you can measure impact. You have insights into what is impacted. And these are really important steps along the journey here to a mature and a successful program. I definitely want to give Erick time to speak here. So go ahead and answer the second Menti, please. And if we can't see the results on the screen, then I'll certainly read them out to you guys.
And what Tracey's talking about at the end of the day, it's capacity, right? So just like the battery on your phone, just like the gas tank in your car, resiliency should be about managing the capacity within the organization to respond to failures, to incidents, to changes, right? I won't tell you where I was, what I was doing in 1999 when the first DRJ happened.
High school.
No.
Oh,
But-
middle school?
But what I will tell you is that Tracey hit a fantastic point, and is progress doesn't happen without change, right? So a lot of the times we talk about maintenance mode. I'm in maintenance mode. And maintenance mode is I have a cycle, and I do that cycle every year. I do a BIA, I do a plan, I do a tabletop, and I repeat it, right? I would argue that if you're not getting better, you're getting worse. And the reason for that is because while you're in maintenance mode within your silo, within your world, the world around you is changing, right? So we saw it in COVID. We're seeing it within the invasion of Ukraine. We're seeing it everywhere, right? The ripple effects, you don't need to be in the middle of the incident to actually be impacted. Supply chain, technology, everything is interconnected, right? And it seems today like the world's a lot more simple, right? Because we have access to everything, right? I can take out my phone and buy a house, buy a car, order a pizza, and rent an apartment in about 5 minutes, right? But what we seem to overlook sometimes is that there's very complex systems in the background that are actually making that happen, right? And those systems are very tightly coupled together that when a failure is experienced within one of those systems, we don't know how the failure is actually going to develop or how the impacts are going to be carried out because the complexities are so vast that we can't plan for everything. So, excuse me. So rather of scenario planning, which I think scenario planning is great for some incidents, rather than planning for these specific scenarios and then trying to figure out when that scenario happens, why our plans did not live up to the plan that we made, looking at things retroactively, is about building that capacity, as Tracey was saying.
Yep. So the answer to the Mentee, it was definitely resources identified as the problem. That was the most popular answer, for sure.
Resources.
Yeah.
Great. So there's been lots of studies out there, folks like us, practitioners, that we ask, what is the reason why your program is not where you want it to be? And these are the 3 top reasons. One's resources, so you guys just confirm that data point, right? That resource is number 1. Number 2 is executive support, right? I think those 2 are tightly coupled together, right? Because if you had executive support, you would have resources, right? And then number 3, the lady that's taking a nap there while we're giving our chat on the screen, is engagement, right? And these are all obviously symptoms of the organizational culture, definitely symptoms of how embedded our programs are within the organizational systems that actually do work every day. But, and I come in the spirit of peace today, I will argue that those are symptoms for an underlying different problem. And that is because we are, again, looking at resiliency as an outcome to achieve, right? So how many of you do executive dashboards and reporting? Almost all of you, right? Is there a metric within your executive dashboards of incidents that you've actually had that year? I would say that the answer is more than likely yes. So we're saying that no incidents equals resiliency, right? So we're measuring resiliency as the absence of events rather than the presence of capacity. And that is a huge problem, in my opinion, because we experienced it during COVID, right? Like we all had pandemic plans that if they were 20 or 30% actionable, I think we're probably in a good spot, right?
And the same applies to reporting on BIAs or plans that you've built, or even your plan maintenance cycles. What does it mean? I've done 50 BIAs. So what? Well done. It's not the right metric to be reporting at an executive level.
Yep. And Tracey touched up on a great point about COVID, and if it would have happened in 1999, we wouldn't have been able to respond the way that we had. And that is a perfect example of that tight system coupling, and we don't know how the failure will present itself or how it actually carry out, right? And we saw that as we execute our pandemic plans, because our pandemic plans were not based around switching to remote work, right? They were based around 30% or more of our work staff won't actually come in. So the challenges that we're experiencing were completely different, right? We didn't have challenges of people actually falling ill and work not being able to be performed. Our challenges was how do I take Tracey's desk from her office in Chicago and move it to her living room, or move it to her kitchen counter, or move it to her kitchen table, or move it to the spare bedroom. Those were some of the biggest challenges, right? And then as we exposed that system, then we got into cyber incidents, vulnerabilities, and all these other things, right? So I think it is on us as practitioners to switch the conversation with our stakeholders that resiliency is not the absence of incidents, right? How many incidents we have during the year doesn't really matter. How the organization responds to those incidents and what the capacity of that organization to actually continue to perform successful work is what matters, right? I'm gonna quote the great poet, Rocky Balboa, when he said, it's not about how hard of a hit you can take, it's about how many hits you can take and keep moving forward, right? And that's what it's about, is how do we keep work, successful work, from actually being carried out in the organization.
And frankly, are we ever out of an incident these days?
No.
I mean, again, it's, you know, it's the way the world spins, right? We're working for global companies, people working in locations all over the world, right? There's always something happening, right? And whether you're just monitoring it before it becomes, you know, something you want to action on, we're dealing with multi-layered events, I think, on a daily, weekly basis.
Yeah, and it's all the tightly coupling of systems, right, that make that happen.
Yeah.
You're probably thinking, okay, that sounds great in theory, but how the heck do I do that? So how we do this in my organization is we start with some principles that not only guide our program, but guide how we look at system design, guide how we look at operational and event learning. And these are not meant to tell your organization what to do, right? These are simple truths that we utilize to make sure that as we go on our everyday operations, we utilize these principles to make sure that we're leading the organization in the right way. The first one is that learning and improving is vital. And those two need to come together, right? You need to learn, and then you need to improve, right? If that's not taking place, you're really not becoming a learning organization and directing your organization in the right way. There is a couple of sub-bullet points within learning and improvement, right? Number one is, does your organization have the tools and the ways to actually elicit feedback from your organization, right? So it's easy for all levels of the organization to give feedback, so all of us can learn at all levels, because the way that workers execute work and leaders manage work and executive build strategies for leaders to execute, we all look at work in a completely different way. And if you think about it, if Tracey is the face of the organization, if she's a frontline employee, she has the most interaction with risk out of anybody in the organization. Yet she has the least amount of influence on the systems and the processes that we put in place that actually enable her to get her job done, right? So how do we get that knowledge from Tracey to actually make operations better? The other thing here is, for folks like us, when we say learning and improvement, we automatically think hot washes, incident debriefs, lessons learned. I would highly encourage you to, when you go into your lessons learned, think about the what, not the who, right? It's very easy to retrospectively look at an incident. It happens every day, right? Where it automatically becomes a sort of a finger-pointing exercise. This didn't happen because of this. And you'll see it if you do incident investigations, or if you read incident investigation reports, a huge chunk of them trace back to human error, right? Which human error is never causal because humans are fallible, right? We make mistakes. If your system doesn't have the flexibility to account for human error, then the system failed your organization, not the worker failed your organization, right? The other one is that capacity is what's important, right? So really focus on building that capacity. I am a risk management practitioner, and I say this all the time, and sometimes I get weird looks from my executive team. I don't manage risk. I manage controls. The risk is always going to be there, right? The risk will ebb and flow based on the condition and the environment within the world in which we operate. What I manage are the controls that the organization has in place to when real world conditions and that risk meet and we have an event, that we have the capacity to not have a catastrophic event, right? The third one is that there is no such thing as perfection, right? So your employees are not perfect, your systems are not perfect, your offices are not perfect. There is no perfection in anything that we manage, right? When you're looking at your BIAs, when you're looking at your event learning, if you find yourself that a system requires perfection from the operator, it's an issue with the system, right? Like I mentioned before in learning and improvement. That is one of the biggest things that you can take away from today is that the question is always more important than the answer. How you ask the question is really going to frame the answer that you get, right? And if you really want to learn of what's happening in your organization, learning's biggest enemy is knowing. Because if you think you know, you're going to ask the answer to confirm what you already know, right? So it's all about how we frame those discussions.
Yeah, so I think there's a point that needs underscored there, because I think that all of us are trying to do more with less. Okay, almost every company I speak to, right, says that they want more resources. We need more resources, feeling the pressure, feeling the stress. And I think that in many instances, human nature is to complete the task, complete what I've been asked to do, instead of maybe slowing down to go fast and thinking about, is this the right, action that I am taking? And we had a great conversation the other day about asking the right questions. And I'm going to take this back and put it into the context of incident management, or even when you're doing a BIA. Are you asking the right questions? Because if you're not asking the right questions, you're completing the task, but you may not have any value in the data that you've gathered. Yep. Right? And so I encourage all of you to just kind of let that sink in and go, and just think about, your day-to-day activities and initiatives that you're leading, and take a moment and question yourselves. Are you asking the right questions?
100%.
And I know that I'm not perfect.
There's no such thing as perfection.
Exactly. And so we can always improve, but we need to take a moment and take the time to recognize that, and to recognize that we can improve our approach, or we can improve the outcome, and that we shouldn't be doing all the time. Right. And I think, just where we are right now in dealing with such high pressure world events, a lot of us are in the wheel, just doing.
Yep. Yeah, and by asking the right questions, we start building the context in the organization, right? And then that context is what really drives the behavior of your workforce. So if you think about it, there's very little autonomy that your organization gives us, right? We have the systems in which we work in, and those systems drive our behaviors, right? Our organizations are context-created entities, and then we live within that context. We operate our work within that, right? And it's a cycle that keeps happening, right? And there's some very powerful systems everywhere that you look, right? When you go grocery shopping, you know why, if the entrance to the grocery store is here, why the milk is all the way over there, right? That wasn't put in to make sure that store is easier to keep inventory in check. It was put in place because that is one of the most commonly shopped items, and you want to expose your shoppers from here to there to every other thing that you can sell them, right? It's that context, right? If we make the road narrower, you're going to drive slower because you feel constricted by that system, right? So how we design those, not only within our organization, these are great things to call out in your BIA when you're looking at processes, systems in which the work is actually being performed in your organization, but you can do the same thing within your programs, right? The context that you build around your exercises, the context that you build around event learning, those are really gonna drive the outcomes that you wanna achieve. The fifth principle is that blame is the enemy of understanding, right? And I touched upon this a little bit earlier before and how we sort of point the finger. And what happens a lot of the times is when we do that, we miss the opportunity to learn, right? And we miss the opportunity to learn because we stop at the point where we actually find a root cause that leads back to a person or a team or whatever it may be. But we don't learn anything from that, right? So if Tracey makes a mistake and that mistake ends up costing our organization X, by getting rid of Tracey, we don't fix the likelihood that then I'm gonna come behind Tracey and make the same mistake. Because the same conditions are there, Tracey just triggered it. She didn't create it, right? She's working within the system that we have within the organization. Which ties into our last principle, which is how leadership response to events matter, right? And that is one of the most impactful things within your organization, right? There's a lot of examples out there that we can chat about on great leadership response to events, both internally and externally. How many of you have worked for an organization where the external leadership response to an event did not mimic the internal response to that event, right? So your leadership is showing the world, its clients, its stakeholders, that we are reacting this way. This is who we are, this is our core values, this is what we're gonna do, but internally we're doing something completely different, right? And that creates a context within your organization to where it makes it nearly impossible for you to learn from your operations because it becomes taboo for then your workforce to actually present opportunities for learning and improvement to leadership, right? And if you don't create that environment where you elicit information and you actually do something with it, right? It's sort of circling that loop, right? If you come to me and you say, hey, Erick, there's an issue in our manufacturing facility. We've been working with default equipment, and one of these days somebody's gonna get hurt. And I said, yeah, we'll take care of it, don't worry about it. We'll have somebody out to fix it. And 3 months go by, nothing happens. And now you have an incident, right? The first thing that you're gonna thought of is, well, I told the suit over there 3 months ago that this was broken, and he told me that he was gonna fix it, and nothing happened, right? So these are what we use within my organization. These are tweaked from the concepts of human and operational performance, where previous lives, as I mentioned, we looked at workers and workers' interaction with critical and high impact, high potential incidents. This is more taking some of those principles and tweaking them to match your organization. Because at the end of the day, your organization is a living, breathing thing, right? It's just a heck of a lot more complex than one individual. Is the amalgamation of all the individuals within your organization. And then we do this, we measure ourselves and where we are within that journey, right? Are we living up to our principles? Are we the organization that we want to be, right? Are we walking the talk, right? Because it's great to say, hey, this is who we are, this is what we stand for. And how we do this, we ask our organization to self-assess, right? At all different levels of the organization to see how they feel about our learning culture, how they feel about how we respond to incidents, right? And we take that information and figure out where we are, right? And if you work for a big organization, you're gonna have subcultures, right? You're gonna have a group that's gonna be at a stage 4, and you're gonna have a group that is at stage 1, right? And you're gonna have most of your organization potentially a stage 2 or whatever it may be, right? And it's how we sort of build that baseline and have that continuous improvement time and time again.
I just want to add there in terms of culture. You know, the culture of your program is it has to go with the culture of your company. You cannot swim upstream. You will not be successful. So you truly have to understand the culture of your organization. And in doing so, taking a look at the mission and taking a look at core values is a really, really great way to fully understand what your company is all about and align your program to those values. I had a really amazing conversation with a customer of ours a couple of weeks ago. They're in the insurance industry. And about 6 months ago, they made resilience a core value of the company. So every single employee understands how important resilience is in their role and to the company as a whole. There's even onboarding videos about resilience. If you go to their website, it says right on the first page, we are resilient. How powerful is that? I mean, it's incredibly powerful, and you can see that the program is taken so seriously, and there's just this great understanding and visibility all the way through the different departments and the employees. And that really is, it's putting the motivation there for the program to be successful.
100%. In Tracey's first poll, I think we were a little bit over 106, if my arithmetic skills have not diminished during the pandemic, to where you were either in build-out mode or you felt that you needed improvement,
yeah.
Right? So I would challenge you, when you go to your next BIA cycle, instead of opening your BIAs with, if this incident were to happen, how will you react? Ask how work is done. How does normal operations take place on a Tuesday at 9 a.m. when the sun shines and rainbows and there's no storms? Understand how actual work is done. Because one of the biggest mistakes that we make in our profession is to look at recovery at a totally different procedure than normal operations, right? We should be doubling down on normal operations and figuring out when things are not working right because we've had an event, how do we sort of steer the bus back on the road, right? And we can't do that if we don't understand what normal operations look like. If we don't understand what success looks like on an everyday basis, we're not able to do that. Then understand what the impacts are if that work is not successful, right? Instead of starting with, hey, this happened, and how will you react to it, is what do we do every day? How do we do it? Why do we do it that way? Who are our stakeholders? What happens if that doesn't get done, right? Is there regulatory impacts? If so, what's our SLAs? Who are our clients? What is the resource concentration of this location? What is our client concentration, right? Because it could be that 80% of your revenue is coming from a single client, right? So these are all the things that I would challenge you to look at in your BIAs.
Ask the right questions.
Exactly, because the question is always more important than the answer.
Yeah.
And that would give you a ton of information for you to go back and build your controls, right? Because if on your BIA you're uncover that 80% of your revenue comes from a single client, I guarantee your third-party risk management program will start taking a serious look at that client, right? And you start working within your finance and your sales teams on how you can actually diversify the income streams within your organization, right? And that's how we add value, right? I would urge you to stop driving your executive team and your organization to thinking that we add value by responding to incidents when they happen. I think that's just a byproduct of building capacity, right? What we do is we really build capacity, right? We are like the immune system of the organization. We try to make sure that that organization is resilient when facing adversity. And if it's not, we're going to step in and execute our plans, our processes that we have in place. And as you elicit this feedback from your organization and you start learning about what normal operations look like, when you start getting into event learning, be very honest with yourselves and your organization and ask the very simple question, were we good or lucky, right? So I'll give you an example. We had a power outage within a whole 3-mile radius of one of our critical data centers, right? But our data center was not impacted. So at that point, we were like, oh, great, our data center was not impacted. And I asked the question, how come we weren't impacted? Like, well, we didn't lose power. Okay, so we were within the quarter block that didn't lose power. What happens if we would have lost power? Well, that would have been a big event because that data center doesn't have a backup generator. Okay. So I think it would be great if we equip that data center, since it's critical, with a backup generator, because we just got really lucky, right? We just avoided a major incident. And if we didn't ask the right questions, we would have automatically assumed that, hey, that's a hardened facility, right? Something happened and we weren't impacted. 3-mile radius blackout, not a big deal for us. It is a big deal when we're within the blackout, right? and not the surrounding of that. So give your organization the opportunity to give you that feedback. And when you ask the questions, if you're an organization that does near miss or near accident or near hit reporting, whatever it is that you call it, phrase the question on what worked, right? You're gonna get a lot more thoughtful feedback if you ask what worked well during that event, instead of saying what didn't work or what failed or who made a mistake or what process wasn't in place, right? Because automatically we fall back to self-preservation, right? And it's like, well, that wasn't my role to do. That was Tracey's role to do.
Well, communicating bad news is not easy.
Not at all.
Right. And again, that goes back to human nature.
Yep.
But, you know, for all of us in these important roles, we have to be able to communicate bad news a lot faster than the good news.
100%.
Right? That has to be a priority.
Yep. And when you do your BIAs, right, and we're all definitely guilty of this, how many of you ask if a process that you're incorporating into a BIA has an SOP or a procedure for it? You review the procedure? You do? Good. So procedures are great, right? The problem with procedures is that usually the people that perform the work didn't write the procedure, right? So it's usually me writing the procedure for something that I couldn't do if I had to do it. So whoever's writing that procedure views work as being linear, right? So it's like we expect machine-like reliability as that process is being executed, and it never is. How many of you had talked to employees before on the field because you've gone out and asked, you know, I read your procedure, is this how it gets done? And they go, yeah, we don't even look at it because the procedure is not really how we do it, right? It's just a compliance thing. We just have it there in case somebody asks for it, right? It's a problem, because if you're building your recovery based on that procedure that nobody execute because it wasn't really meant to do that, then that's a huge problem. So think about that, right? Because how work is done, it ebbs and flows depending on who's doing it, depending on what's happening that day, depending on what systems are working correctly, what systems are not, what pressures you're getting from leadership if you're in a production environment. That work looks completely different, right? So if we go back and we look at real world conditions, right? Usually you can do that procedure that was written this way, but actually executed this way. It's not a problem. You do that for 15, 20 years. You never have an incident. Nobody ever thinks about it, right? Then you have a 25-year employee that has one day where the real world conditions met how that work is being executed, and you have an incident, right? And all of a sudden, you go into, how could that happen? What did he do? What did she do? How come they didn't follow procedure? And you go into your investigation and you think about the deviation between how they did the work and how the work was supposed to be done, right? And the story I was telling you earlier about the fatality investigation that I had, that's one thing that kept coming up, right? And it kept coming up not from his peers, it kept coming up from supervisors. Well, he didn't follow procedure. It was a policy violation, right? But then when you talk to the workforces, well, we never do it that way. If we did it that way, you would be here every other week doing one of these because we would actually hurt ourselves, right? When you look at that difference between the deviation, you're really getting nothing, right? Your systems are not improving, nothing is happening. But when you look at the difference between how that work is done and how it actually ebbs and flows and how it's so complex and how real work conditions are actually giving you a gap to allow successful work, that's really important information. Because that is what's giving you the information to go back and build your controls, right? That is really telling you what brittleness you have in your system, what stable parts of your system you have, and you can go back and build that into there, right? That's really where operational learning lives. And nowadays, and I have this conversation with my executive team all the time, they want indicators, right? They want key performance indicators, and they want key risk indicators. And now we're getting into lagging indicators and leading indicators and transformational indicators, right? And let's give it another 6 months and we'll have another buzzword for indicators. Yeah. But the biggest indicator that you can have in your organization is an actual near miss that didn't lead to a catastrophic event. Because that really shows you that, hey, I have controls in place that prevented this really bad thing from happening, right? Or, hey guys, we need to put this into the red bucket of our risk matrix because this needs immediate attention in order for us to build that capacity so when this happens again, we don't have a catastrophic event.
You have some really, really good talk track around this. So Erick and I have a working relationship where we talk a lot. And I think it's really fascinating that he runs such a tight program with a good amount of resources, but it's certainly not a team of 20. And I feel like there's this concept of work smarter, not harder. And so for me, just in lots of conversations that we've had together, I've learned from Erick that there's a different approach. There's a different way of thinking. There's a slow down and really evaluate what you're asking, how you're posing questions. Understand the organization. And again, I think we're all going really so fast that we're maybe not doing those things. But in order to support this program as a whole, we also have to have the data in place to be able to produce those metrics, to be able to have the opportunity to evaluate an event and say, were we good or were we lucky? And I think that there's some things we can do in terms of using that data and using that intelligence throughout the whole life cycle where we can see indicators of success. We can see indicators of where we need to improve. We're dealing with these multi-layered events that are coming at us really, really fast. But there's also technology and innovation out there that can help us identify gaps before it is catastrophic, that can help us do scenario type testing, that can help us take our work and our program to a completely different level and then communicate it back. That's another thing that I've learned, right? You have to be communicating back. So don't always be producing metrics that are showing how great your program is. Look at it, it's so fantastic. And be bold enough to ask the questions in the right way, and bold enough to be able to take all the reds to the executive team and talk about the risk that's out there, right? you said that you really are the controller, right? You're putting the controls in place. Really like that as well. Very subtle difference, but quite powerful when you explained that.
And how many of you actually have had conversations within your teams when you're putting a dashboard together that says, we can't take this as the executive team? It's like 3 things green, everything is yellow and red. Are you kidding me? Right? We've had those conversations.
Yeah.
Right? We have them. We actively have those conversations. But think about this. When was the last time that a green box kept an event from happening? When was the last time in critical, high-risk operations that a green box kept somebody from having a severe injury? Never, right? Because you think of the green box as like, hey, I'm done with that. I'm going to move on to my reds or my ambers, and that's what I'm going to focus on. And how you present that to leadership, green boxes are not bad. I mean, green boxes are not bad. Red boxes are not bad. It's just our job is to hold up the mirror to your executive team and say, hey, do you like the reflection that you see of our organization and how we stand in our capacity to build controls and manage risks? And if the answer is yes, then that's great, right? You've managed the expectation, the risk tolerance, the appetite. I mean, these are completely different conversations that we can have around the concepts of managing risks. But embrace those red boxes, right? Because those red boxes get immediate attention, right? Those red boxes get resources.
Resources, budget.
Yeah. They get,
right?
Not only that, it shows the organization that you're adding value. And going back to the building of culture and building of capacity, how many of you had, I don't want to say downplay, but potentially not brought red boxes to your executive team? And then that condition showed, and you got the question of, hey, did you know that this was happening? Did you know that we didn't really have a backup generator in that data center? Why didn't you tell us, right? At that point, leadership's going to play the blame game on what happened, right? Instead of asking the questions of, why don't you feel comfortable bringing me red boxes, right? So it's how you start shifting that thinking, right? And this doesn't happen overnight. You know, Tracey was talking about resources. When I joined Finastra, I had a team of 2 plus myself, right? There's also, I think luck is a fantastic cherry on top on everything. So I joined Finastra a week before the pandemic really hit in the US. And then we had a major cyber event 2 weeks after that, right? So my job for about 4 months, I was living in those red boxes, right? I was jumping from one red box to another. And every time I found a new one, it was like, ooh, look what I found, right? And then those red boxes allowed us to build new programs, allowed us to build resources, and today we sit at a team of 20. Granted, not all in the BC space. There's operational risk, there's third-party risk management, there's a couple of us focusing in change management and operational learning, but these are things that weren't there 2 years ago, right? These are things that we embraced those red boxes, we pointed them out, right? Not just pointing them out as like, hey, here's something that we're not doing, right? And your executive team will probably tell you this, don't show me a problem unless you have 4 different ways to fix it. And then I'll pick one of those 4, the one that I think is more suitable for us. And you can sort of drive the context to make sure that they pick the one that you want them to pick, right? You make that one look really good and really achievable. So that's one takeaway that I would urge you to take away from this is hold up the mirror, show current state, and show a path to progression from where you are to where they want to be. And if where they want to be is not where you want them to be, articulate that as well, right? And show them why where you want to be is where the organization should be based on the knowledge that you have of the organization. Because at the end of the day, we are the primary care physicians of that organization. We should know what hurts. We should know what doesn't hurt. We should know when the last checkup was. We should know blood panel numbers. We should know everything in that organization because it is our job when something goes wrong to know how to treat that patient, right? And that patient is the organization.
From Dr. Anez, you heard it here.
Too much schooling, I can't do that.
Well, I want to say thank you to Erick. for co-presenting with me today. And thank you to all of you for attending the session. I see a lot of note-taking. So hopefully you gained some new insights and you enjoyed the content. Erick and I are here for the whole conference, right? So come and seek us out if you want to have a follow-on conversation with this. We are trying to catch up on the time so that you can get back to the normal schedule for the day. But I know that Bob was opening up a Q&A. If you have a couple of questions that you want to put on the monitor, Bob, we can answer a couple of them now. If not, we can just do one-on-ones throughout the day. And I'm not seeing anything on the monitor. So I'd like to invite Vanessa back up here. And thank you, everyone, for your time and attention today.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Special shout out to Rick Newdorf, Ray Holloman, and James Green for the hashtag DRJ Spring on LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm super excited about that. Those of you who have not posted yet, please share that you're in this conference, what you're learning. This not only helps the people that are following you in your community, but it also helps other people to get exposure and access to all the great things that we're doing here at the conference. Please go ahead in the Cvent app and share your notes and your takeaways from today's session. Again, this helps DRJ to plan for future content. A special thank you to Fusion Risk Management, one of our platinum sponsors. And we're gonna take a 10-minute break, but before we do that, can everybody just wave? I'm gonna take a picture of you and share it on my social media. If you don't wanna be in it, put your head down. All right, 1, 2, 3. Awesome, thank you. We'll see you back in 10 minutes, so 10:38. Apple time is the best time. to our third, you guys can't hear me? Okay, what about this? Testing, testing. All right, if you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. Audio guy says I'm good. All right, okay. All right, so our session 3 is going to be our first panel for today, so I'm super excited. Today's panelists will share thoughts on providing accurate. Thank you for your patience, everyone. On providing accurate and effective crisis communications based on experiences that we all have working across multiple industries. In today's fast-paced world, this panel will recommend evolving best practices post-pandemic for management of crisis communications, including diversity and inclusion, considerations, balancing communication, effective channels, overall recommendations, duty to care aspects, and lessons learned. Thank you for your patience, everyone. My AV guy. Scroll to the next screen, please. All right, my business continuity plan is working here. All right. Thank you, guys. All right, so I am very excited to introduce a panel that I've been working with pretty closely the past few weeks. I want to give a warm welcome to Ashley Goosman. She's our moderator for today's panel, Peter Steinfeld, Prashant Tracey, and myself as we speak on crisis communication, providing an accurate, thoughtful voice during a crisis. Let's give them a warm round of applause.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My mic is working. This is great. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today, and especially my esteemed panelists. So let's get right to it. We're going to start off with a topic that we discussed in our last few weeks and really wanted to share with you. So in today's fast-paced world, what do you recommend as best practice for crisis communications? And we're going to start off with Peter, if you don't mind taking that first.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if you guys can't hear me, definitely let me know. But we could spend an entire day, I think, talking about this single question in and of itself. I think we have a couple minutes for each question, so I'll try to sum it up into 4 key, really good takeaways. I think first and foremost, and none of these are in any particular order, I think one thing to always be concerned with is speed. If you can get a message out really, really quickly, like if you've got a hurricane coming, start communicating days in advance. Or something that's a little faster approaching, if you can get hours or even minutes in advance, it can have a huge impact on outcomes just by getting that message out as quickly as possible. So always concentrate on how can I get messages out very, very quickly. Second thing to consider is accuracy. If people don't trust what you're sending out, then they're going to start searching out their own set of facts. And that's where all sorts of confusion and doubt comes in. And that's not good. Those are 2 of the worst things that can happen in an emergency, or confusion and doubt. The other thing I'd say is really important is two-way communication. Why not take advantage of it? There's great technologies out there. In an emergency, if you're just sending information out, but it's one way, you have no idea what's going on in the field. So just getting simple things like read confirmations from people, knowing that a human actually read your message, or taking it to the next step and doing questions, asking people, are you okay? Respond back with 1 for yes, 2 for no, or can you still work? Hugely, hugely valuable, and it can really help you triage how you're going to respond to a situation. And I would say the last thing I would mention is multi-channel, super important. In this day and age, we have so many channels over which we can communicate, so why not take advantage of them? I mean, Susan could be the person that you could text 24 hours a day, 364 days a year, and she's going to respond within seconds, except that one day when the emergency happens. So if you just rely on a single channel, it can put you in a precarious position. So try to communicate across many, many different channels. So I think those are the big things: speed, accuracy, two-way, and multi-channel.
Peter, thank you for those points. I think they're great, so important today. Prashant, did you have anything else that you wanted to add to that as well?
I 100% concur with everything that Peter's saying, but I think the effectiveness should also be measured. Right? In the end, is your tomorrow better than it is today? So every single thing Peter talked about is on point. But the question is, next time this happens, did you do better than last time? And so when there is a crisis, we always talk about the concept of a dwell time, right? If we have a leak in our house and we said, you know what, I have a DRJ symposium, I'll look at it when I come back. What's the damage? And then you say, no, I'm going to fix it before I take a flight. Then what do you think is the damage? So when we talk about two other things that I would like to add here is how do you effectively measure your organization's performance is key to how you move forward. And number two, what do you do with the temporal nature of the thing? You have to communicate before, you have to communicate effectively during, and you also have to effectively communicate after. So do take into account the temporal nature of your communication doesn't end just because something hit the fan now. What did you do yesterday? What are you going to do tomorrow so that your tomorrow is better than where it stands today? So I think those things are something that we can also look at in addition to everything that Peter said.
Great points.
Thank you for that. Aligned with that, so really great points as well. Companies know that it's very important to control the narrative in a crisis to protect brand reputation. And how do you suggest that they go about that to maximize return on investment and return on value? And Prashant, do you want to take that first?
Let's have some fundamental problem with the question. You know, I don't think it was meant to be asked that way, but we need to control the narrative. I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that approach, right? We don't need to control the narrative. We need to do the right thing. That's the point here, right? But now we're talking about ROI. Look, you have to make investments in technology. You have to make investments in people, most importantly. Your processes have to be aligned. So for you to be able to measure the ROI, it's sort of a takeoff from the previous question. How effective are you? If you don't have a baseline of where you stand today and how you're measuring, you have no concept of knowing what the ROI looks like. But again, if we are talking about an ROI, who is affected when bad things happen? People, your infrastructure, or your brand? But it's a bad thing that's happened. We are using the word crisis here. There cannot be any good thing coming out of a crisis. It's always bad news. And so what is this reputation in a brand? And my contention is this challenge is your best opportunity to gain employee loyalty, customer loyalty, improve your net promoter score. Look, we all know what's the best customer support organization on this planet? The one that never receives a phone call, right? But as corporations, we're always trying to protect the good, people, assets, reputation, brand. Unfortunately, we live in a world where bad things happen all the time. The bad will intersect with the good. And so this is your great opportunity to gain employee loyalty, right? Even the hotels here, you know, we were talking here 30 seconds ago, people are screaming, I want to shower before it's, none of these ladies coming up and saying, we understand what you're going through. I said, really appreciate, I'm so sorry. I got a little irritated there. But you know what? That lady just earned customer loyalty. That gentleman still didn't get the room, by the way. And so when we talk about the ROIs, right, it's a great opportunity if you can effectively communicate with transparency, with honesty, and leverage those multimodalities that, you know, sometimes you may have to overtake somebody's desktop. That's fine, right? You do not have time for somebody to pick up the phone and read. I'm not looking at it right now. But let's say a crisis event occurred just now and these monitors were taken over, we will react, right? So measure yourself effectively, acknowledge the fact that the bad is all right, manage that change, then your ROI calculators will be effective.
I love how you talked about acknowledging. I think that's a really important piece to do. And then I wanted to ask Peter, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, no, those are fantastic points. I would say a couple other things are know your audience. When you're in an emergency, there's all sorts of different people that need to be communicated with. You've got folks who are involved in the situation. They're right in the line of fire. You got people who are miles away, could be a few, could be dozens, hundreds, thousands. They all need to know, and then you have people that are tangentially involved, like investors and things like that. They're going to want to know something too. So the first thing you should focus on clearly is safety, human safety. Like immediately communicate with those who are in harm's way and make sure they're okay. And then you can shift toward dealing with the business in general, reaching out and figure out who can work, who can't work. And then communicating with investors and making sure they know what's going on. I think that's really, really important. The other idea is this, it's kind of an idea of over-communication. In an emergency, what we typically find when we talk to a lot of customers is those who erred on the side of oversharing, not in an inappropriate way, but they just overshared, tended to have better outcomes than they otherwise would have had. Like you said before, I mean, it's an emergency, nothing is better, but you can have worse outcomes and better outcomes when something bad happens. And it really comes down to their willingness to share when those things happen. And the reason why, it's what you mentioned earlier, it's people generally will give individuals and organizations the benefit of the doubt when they're trying to do the right thing and showing their values and sharing information. It's when people close off and get secretive, then they really doubt you, and it sows all sorts of confusion and doubt out there, and that's how you lose control of the narrative. And really, that's just trying to do the right thing. So over-communicate, but do it in an appropriate way. I think that's the key, and we'll talk more about that, and we got some great questions about that a little bit later.
Just one thing to add there. So to the point of controlling the narrative, I spoke to a superintendent the other day, and they had a Title IX situation. So a school did not handle the process of a sexual assault correctly. And then secondly, they were in the news for over 5 days locally because of the amount of gun violence in this school. So the superintendent calls and said, hey, I need help. I want to talk to a crisis communications team. I need help controlling the narrative. Okay, so the question was asked, well, what is the narrative? So he's looking like, I don't know. Okay, well, what are you doing about this issue? And what have you been doing? Who is responsible for this at your organization? How did this happen? What processes are you working through? So before you can ask someone to help you control a narrative that doesn't align back to your values and who you say you are, and because your face is plastered on the news screen, it doesn't mean that we're ready to start communicating to control a story that you haven't dealt with yet. And so I think it's important for us as practitioners, we have to be asking the tough questions to help them to think about what they're asking about. And once you pull together an action plan, once you put in place the right resources to help you, I can then help you control the narrative because you're giving me something to control and to leverage. But without that information, I can't do much to help you except to bring the attention back to you as a leadership team. And so I think that's important about just controlling that narrative is we've got to ask them what the right questions are.
I love that real world example. Thank you so much for that. Before we move on, though, I do want to touch on something, Prashant, you said in the importance of technology. Now, I know that's in your wheelhouse, and same with Peter, but any three of you, do you want to touch on just exactly why you think technology and the use of it really brings things forward from our old, call trees that we've used for years? And sorry if any of you are still using those out there, but love if you just briefly touch on that. I think it would be helpful.
I think, look, I have vested interest in selling technology, right? We are vendors. But I'll tell you, technology, automation, tools is a means of efficiency, right? It does not replace people, which is the most important thing, and it cannot trump the process. For example, I'll ask you folks, pick your fastest car, the cars that you love. One of you will say BMW, a Jaguar, and a Corvette, and whatever. Now I put the wrong GPS in it. You know what will happen? You'll reach the wrong place faster. That's what technology can do for you. Yeah. If you have the wrong people with the wrong DNA or the skill set, and you don't have lightweight processes that can help, technology will only get you to the wrong place faster, right? So as much of a vested interest I have in leveraging technology, I would say let's start with the people. Let's start with a lightweight process. If you have good people that understand why this is important, right? Your passion for the mission, I want to keep people safe. I want to do the right thing. I want to be transparent and honest. If you have the right people and you give them a lightweight process, the product and technology will take care of itself. Usually good things will come out. But technology is very important to the point that Peter was making. Your ability to have multimodal communications. People prefer to be spoken to in different ways. And just like Peter said, based on the audience that you're trying to reach to, your language, your grammar, your message needs to change. The way you communicate to your CEO when a crisis occurs is very different than the way you speak with your customers. Is very different the way you will speak to your crisis team that's actually trying to fix the problem, right? So technology is fantastic, but concepts of multimodal communications, having a good process that you can digitize, process orchestration, these are some of the technological elements you can certainly leverage, but my suggestion would be we start with the people, then look at your process. And I think in the previous session also, they were talking about start somewhere, acknowledge where the gaps are. So I would say start there. Vendors like us will become ankle biters. We will come and try to sell you something. Don't worry about it. But I think people and process are more important.
Thank you for that. So if you want to learn more about tools or enhancing your tools, talk to these guys later.
Yes. I would make one comment on that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, fantastic stuff that he just shared. One mistake we often see when people buy new technology is they try to apply that technology to the old way of doing things. And that just, yeah, I hear some ahas there. That doesn't work. If you try to take an old process and say, oh, let's just do the same thing, but with this new tech, you're probably setting yourself up for failure. So always think about that when you're implementing new tech. It's like, okay, we're embracing a new way of doing something. Let's take advantage of all it has to offer. And it can make a big difference. Like when you go from adding and subtracting on a piece of paper and you go to Excel, like you can do the same thing, but there's so much more you can do as well. So take advantage of that.
Okay, thank you. Vanessa, I wanted to follow up on what you were sharing before. So what do you think that a company should do in terms of initial actions when they're communicating for a crisis?
I think it goes back to your brand and who you say you are as an organization, and that has to be felt in everything. One thing that I'll say throughout this entire panel is, does our audio match our video? If what I say and what I write and put out on social media and in statements, or how I ask my PR or crisis comms team to respond, does that reflect what we actually do? And I think that's the big question that this room of people, as we think about what's happening in the world, it's not just about our processes and our plans and the technology, but literally, right, why are we here at this conference? How are we going to go back and apply these things to real world situations that are happening? And going back to the first speaker's presentation, the data's there. Your new hires, your new talent wants to ensure that your audio matches your video. And we are responsible for asking those questions. And so I think it goes back to, what is your role as a school system? What's your role as a superintendent? What's the role as your board? And how are you leveraging that and sharing that information down throughout the organization so that it's a consistent theme and a message throughout? So you're not asking people to control a narrative. You've thought through, how can I ensure that what I'm asking people for is a reflection of who we say we are?
I think that's a great point, because you were talking about earlier how that company you felt, or that school system, wasn't ready for that. And I think it's so great that you just said they need to determine who they are, what they are, how they do their work, and how they communicate ahead of time. Great. Prashant, anything else that you wanted to add to that?
No, I think she nailed it. How prepared are you? It's a simple question. How prepared are you for different types of critical events? So what will you do when something happens? And so go and challenge yourself today. In the absence of a crisis event, nothing beats a tabletop exercise, right? We all seem to have, I mean, for 25 years, every 3 months we have a fire alarm go on and you have to leave your buildings and offices. But I still go around seeing customers that are in the middle of a, South China Sea with a typhoon, a tornado hit area, or hurricanes, and they say, have you done a tabletop exercise? It's going to be that time of the year where hurricanes come. We said, we haven't got to that yet, but we have a nice document. Where is it? It's a PDF binder. It's part of our GRC policy. So this goes back to the point she was making, and what will you do if this were to happen? And it goes back to Peter's point on leveraging technology. Have the two worlds even come and met? Or would it be the first time you'll activate it? So one thing we always need to recognize, it's human nature. During the times of stress, your brain will not work optimally. That's human nature. That's true for all of us. None of us are, Michael Jordan and Michael Phelps and all those folks that thrive under that kind of stress. Most of us wilt, right? But the difference why some people perform better than the other is training. How prepared are you for that unforeseen situation? And then you can play audible. That is why military folks have training exercises, right? Because it prepares them for that environment. So how prepared are you? It's not a question for this panel to answer, but all of us need to ask ourselves, how prepared are we? Pick any 3-4 critical events. You talked about sexual assault. I'll say active shooter. Hurricane, civil unrest outside your branch offices. Heck, something simple as manhole cover blowing up right outside your branch office. Are you ready for a simple flooding event? If you can't answer honestly that we are, we know these are the 3 things. This is what HR does. This is what the facility managers does. This is how we communicate to our executives. Then we are in bad shape. So I think it's an exercise that we need to do ourselves. Are we ready? That's a simple question to answer, actually. Yes, no, maybe.
2 things I would add to that, that's all great stuff, is they kind of go together, but share information, even if it's imperfect. And if you know what your core values are, as you described earlier, that'll come through, and it's okay. People are okay with that. You don't want to struggle in silence. That's one of the worst things you can do. And I would say the other thing is, to go along with that, establish a rhythm of communication. Don't be really sporadic. Humans are creatures of rhythm, and we like to see things come in regular patterns. And if we don't, it creates confusion and doubt and things like that, which we've talked about being bad. So I think those are valuable as well.
Thank you guys for all of that. I'd like us to dig a little bit deeper, right? Because I think most of us in the audience have thought about some of these concepts and these points. But I'd love more on the how. So I'm going to lob this to you, Peter, first, is really, can we give some examples, either best case or worst case, of how companies have communicated effectively, either internally or externally?
Yeah, to me, just to, I guess, simplify it, it really comes down to being proactive, everything you just said, versus being reactive. And the companies who do really, really well, or better than average, are those who can get really proactive in a wide variety of categories. I would say first is they invest in technology and take advantage of it. We talked about it before. Just because you can walk 5 miles to work doesn't mean that's a good thing to do anymore. You should get a car. Or just because you can add and subtract on paper, why not get a calculator or invest in Excel or something like that? So invest in technology that can help you do so many more things than you could have before. So that's number one. Number 2 is everyone's IQ drops 20 points in an emergency, as you just said. It's totally normal. We don't suddenly get stupid. It's just we're stressed. We have fear. You're not thinking straight. So create templates in advance. You can't think of every scenario that might happen, but you can think of a lot. And when you're under stress, you're like, oh, thank goodness, I already kind of thought of this before, and 80% of what I need is there. I just got to fill in the other 20%. So I think that's really important. The other thing that's really important to do, a third thing, is to proactively watch the world around your people and locations to see, are there any things that could pop up? Let's get ahead of it. It's always good to be 2 steps ahead of things instead of being 2 steps behind them. And if you can't go out and hire a ton of people and establish a global security operations center, that's okay. There's technology out there that can do it for you and help you get alerted to those things. And then I would say the last thing is, and this comes back to what you were saying, is just training. You have to train people on what they're supposed to do, and they need to have backups. And typically, you want to make sure that the people who are doing the communicating are those who are on the ground. It doesn't, the CEO doesn't always have to be the one communicating about everything. CEO could know the least about what's going on. Someone who needs, who's local in the disaster needs to be empowered to communicate. So I think that's what I would cover there.
Great, thank you for that. And I think it's such a great point that cognition goes down right, during crisis, and I think most of us know that. I know with my company, I dealt with 49 events last year, and I wasn't always the lead for that, but obviously supporting that and having those templates, right, is so, so helpful. So thank you for raising that as well. Vanessa, I think we talked that you might take the next one. And as Vanessa said, I think in the beginning, we've talked and connected for the last few weeks. And I think what's unfortunately you guys are missing is we were having such great conversations that we were saying at the end, like, we wish we could record this because we were just jumping in and playing off each other and adding. So please, if you want to chat more with us afterwards, do so. But Vanessa, I know you had some great points too.
Yeah, so this question about how do we communicate effectively and quickly and best and worst case examples. So I worked with the retail company. That's what brought me to Charlotte. And when I came into the organization, the entire resilience program from disaster recovery to business continuity and each function was disjointed. And so one thing that we did, which goes back to being proactive, was we created a space for all of the leaders who owned risk to communicate more. And I feel like sometimes when we talk about things in our profession, it's not rocket science, but it's just like reminding people of, hey, we should do this. And we were able to get together the InfoSec team, the PR team, the risk management team, the operations and the supply chain team. And what we started to see was everybody was experiencing risk or threats in their environment, but we were not communicating what was happening from an InfoSec perspective and how that might be showing up on the PR side of the house. And so the result was having more frequent touch points, going back to rhythm. And they started to meet on a bi-weekly basis to help them manage risk, to help them be more effective, to help them be more responsive. And so similar to that, our company has taken the same approach. We call it having a pulse. So my team hates meetings, but I believe in meetings. I believe in meetings with a clear objective, a clear timeline, and clear outcomes. And for us, it has helped us to have a rhythm, a pulse, and a heartbeat. But also, I'm clear about what's going on in each functional responsibility. People are coming to these conversations to get what they need. And so when things happen that catch us off guard or that we're not prepared for, we have the ability to respond. And I think being prepared and having a rhythm takes you from being responsive versus to being reactive. And so I would consider that as a good example of when you walk into an organization. This company was 50 years old. So you would think, hey, depending on the brand, they have it figured out. But I think most of us know that's why we have these jobs, because we don't have it figured out.
I always say that I want to, do my job so well that I work myself out of a job, but unfortunately that's not happening, as we've heard from the data earlier today. But Vanessa, also along with that, can you share a little bit from your perspective and the work that you do in advising customers? What does that good communication look like? What are some examples? You talked about pre-scripting, but then if you could also talk about execution, that would be great. I'd love to hear that.
So I will say that I am at heart business continuity and crisis management practitioner. I'm not a crisis communications or reputation management expert, and I believe that those lines exist for a reason. But what I will share is I am often invited to the table and having conversations with those that are in those spaces. And so we actually did a podcast on this. It's called the intersection of reputation management and resilience. And I believe to be effective, I'm always going to go back to the core values because that's your clear brand message. And why that's important, I started a company 7 years ago, and I was in a meeting and somebody said, "What are your core values?" And I was like, I don't know. And I wrote the values, but I couldn't remember what our values were. And it reminded me of being in an organization where the words are the words on the wall, but they're not executed and people don't live the values. And so it really challenged me to go back inside of my own company and document what are my values. And I would say, if you are in an organization that has a preset of values, what are your values in your department, in your leadership? And how do you display that amongst your team so everybody has the same principles and you're attracting the right people? And that has also helped us to find better talent. There's a certain type of person that we look for. There's a certain type. And when we're sourcing for candidates, we're looking for this one thing that every client says we have. And if I don't see that and hear that, And if the team doesn't see it and hear it, we do not hire you. I've come across great people with great backgrounds, but the number one priority is you have to be in alignment to our core values. And if you don't align, it's a no for our company. And so I think that's important for every department and for every person here. So after you have a clear brand message, I would definitely say it's the documentation of clear governance and frameworks and strategies that align back to that brand. And then thirdly, of course, it's training. But what I would also say is outside of training, we need more at-bats, right? So how do you become a better speaker? You speak. I have a stutter. I came into this industry when I would introduce myself, I would stutter. It was really hard for me to get my name out. So if you talk to me for longer than 5 minutes, you will hear my stutter. I'm not weird or crazy. I just have a speech disorder. And so what helped me was to practice, which was more at bats, right? How do you become a better ball player? I used to play. You play ball. You travel, you dribble, you shoot. If you're like my dad, he builds a basketball court and you wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning and you dribble. You sit on the free throw line and you shoot from the free throw line. That's how you become a better ball player. And how do you become better with your weight loss goals? Well, for me, my feet cannot keep up with my mouth. So it's choosing every day to make better decisions about what I eat and making a decision to get up and to work out and to be consistent. Effective communication is no different. This is beyond scripted trainings. It's beyond a tabletop drill. It's how do we have more at-bats? How do we ensure that when things happen, the first speaker showed several blunders from several companies who just didn't get it right. Effective communication is who's in the room. That's inclusive decision making. Who's involved in the decisions? Who's at the table? So in my opinion, what the first speaker slide showed with all those companies that had blunders, what that means is how many of you in risk management and crisis management are in the room before a commercial goes live? You've now found a new business case because this is what it costs you. So in my world, our clients are in human resources, they're in public relations, they're in employee resource groups. We've been doing business with a tech top 10 Fortune company for the past 3 years, and they're ERGs. If my clients are shifting, your clients inside of the organization should also be shifting. And so I think we have to make sure that we're at the right tables, and as we see risk in different parts of the organization, insert yourself. And if they don't bring you a seat, pull up your own seat. But we need to be in those spaces because that's our role.
Vanessa, your comments on cross-functional, multidiscipline teams really resonates so much with me. It's something I've been building in my organization for the last couple of years, and we're finally seeing the fruits where it's feeling natural for us to get together, especially in the communication space. Talk to me more later about that. But if I wasn't partnering closely with my communications group, I wouldn't now have a website for our employees, our first ever within our internal web pages where they can go and see information about preparing throughout the phases of disaster and emergencies. So that was a really powerful outcome for us. But I also really like your comments around having a seat at the table. And I think that's so critical because often we haven't had that seat at the table with leadership. And I'm seeing it a bit more, which is great, but I think we definitely need more of it. So it's really great that you raised that. Rashawn, can you talk about from a vendor's perspective? Because I think both you and Peter and Vanessa, are able to interact with so many other people where some of us are within a company, right? And we only see that culture and we only see that evolution. If there's anything from your perspective about what you've seen that has worked really well that you'd recommend others to look into, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. There's a fundamental mind shift. Everything that we're talking about, we're using words, crisis communication, communicate during crisis, effectiveness of communication. The companies that have succeeded don't talk like this. You know what they talk like? They use the word employee engagement. The correct terminology and the philosophy to approach and measure your performance is how engaged are your employees. Vanessa made a point, do you have a seat at the table? Go and talk to your employees. If they believe they have a seat at the table, they are engaged. If somebody is engaged, you will get something out of them. And if your values are correct, just like she pointed out, then the right things will happen. But if we were to break it down, 3 categories where I see companies succeed a lot. We talked about communication. Yes, that's step number 1. But I really think it's communication. The second leg of the stool is collaboration. The third leg of the stool is orchestration. You have to effectively communicate. You have to effectively collaborate, but understand that the nature of the critical event that's occurring right now or might happen will change. How many times have you seen a SEV1 ticket downgraded to SEV3, a SEV3 ticket upgraded to SEV1, or the reality on the ground is different than what your initial intelligence reported, which means when the nature of the incident changes, so will and should your processes. Can you orchestrate that change in a seamless fashion, especially, like Peter said, your IQ is 20 points less than it is right now, right? So the companies that have succeeded effectively communicate, meaningfully collaborate, and have the right orchestration in place. And now you can leverage technology in all the 3 places. Now you can break it down and say, what technology helps me communicate most effectively? We have silos. This is my cyber team. This is my business continuity team. This is my risk team. This is my physical security team. She's talking about retailers. I was talking to somebody very worried about merchandise theft. I said, okay, so that means doors and video analytics and cameras? Yep. Now I'm talking to the HR person and the lady says, really, Prashant, can you help us? If somebody walks in with a 102-degree temperature, can you light up my board because I want to put my duty of care package with this person? Now I'm saying, wait a minute, that gentleman there that's worried about merchandise theft and you that's worried about COVID and a pandemic, same technology. Why aren't you collaborating? Why haven't you communicated? So when we look at these silos, when I talk about collaboration, it's about that lightweight processes that can cut across these silos. You respect what a business continuity person does. A person responsible for perimeter defense and locking the doors down, really, please don't try to teach him business continuity. That's not that person's job. But how do they effectively communicate, collaborate, and when there is a process handover, how meaningful is it? The value is in the data. We all talk about, hey, I use my favorite tool. This is what I use. You know what? Tools consolidation is a failed exercise. We've been doing tools consolidation since 1970s. It's okay if you have multiple tools. The gold nuggets in the tool is information. Leverage technology to surface the information because that drives knowledge. Knowledge drives intelligence, right? Data, information, knowledge, and intelligence, right? Extract the information that's necessary. Don't get bogged down with what tool you're using. We should all adopt a new tool. Pull a pin on the grenade and everybody will now go to the cloud. Calm down. First, focus on the data that needs to come out. That data will give you the right information and then you'll make informed decisions. So that's how I have seen technology being leveraged, right? Not randomly on let's read another analyst report and whoever is in the top right corner, go buy that product. No, right? Let's look at people and processes just like Vanessa and Peter were talking about. That's what I believe.
Oh, thank you so much for your comments on breaking down silos because it isn't easy, right? Yep. I think all of us are trying to do that across our organizations and with the customers we work with. I think also your points on data and the importance of not just understanding your data or looking at your data, but what you do with it is so important. And I think that's really, I feel like that's a theme, one of our themes for this conference so far. Peter, anything else that you want to add to that, or do you feel like they covered it well?
No, that was fantastic. The only thing I would cover, I was sitting here thinking about one of the clients we work with, and he said something really interesting to me that there's 2 types of communication in a crisis. There's point-in-time communication. So something has just happened, and I need to let people know about it very quickly. And then there is holistic communication, letting people see what's going on in the full context as this incident's unfolding. So getting that point-in-time alert is like hearing a fire alarm. I got to get out of the building. But you forget about it 10 minutes later or an hour later, or 4 hours later. But if you can go back and see, oh yeah, we pulled an alarm at 9 a.m. and then this happened at 10 o'clock and then this happened a few hours later. giving people that ability to view that information holistically throughout the event is incredibly valuable because it puts things in context. And it also lets people catch up who maybe missed the first alarms, so the first alerts that went out. So always think about that. What are my point-in-time communications, and how can I make people aware of what's going on from start to finish in that entire incident?
So Peter, I'm going to bring it back to you again,
Yeah.
and with our theme of trying to keep it real. In terms of a crisis communication team, what does that look like to you? What's your ideal team, if you could put one together, or if you've seen that happen?
We've already talked about some of it, but it's all about making it really cross-functional. Anytime you have a crisis going on, you don't want to operate in a silo. You want to make sure you have representation from the different parts of the business. Super, super important. So get people from legal, HR, the product team, marketing, sales, I mean, everybody as much as possible. Now, that can seem like a lot of cooks in the kitchen, but by not operating in a silo, you're going to get all sorts of valuable feedback and things you never would have thought of. You have to get that input. But the most important thing to do is have a very clear leader, someone who is now designated with saying, okay, thank you for all the input. Now it's time for me to make a decision and go communicate that. And it doesn't always have to be a high-level executive or a CEO or something like that. They may not be the best person to put out in front of the public or whomever you need to communicate with. It could be because they're not great communicators, or because sometimes it's nice to have a little plausible deniability, like get someone else out there that can represent you, and then they can say, I need to go back and check with the CEO to get you additional information. So make that team really cross-functional to get as many points of input as you can, but have a very clearly defined leader who's going to communicate out whatever the messaging is.
Thanks for raising that. I know one of the things that I've been seeing is if I'm Googling crisis management, it'll come up as crisis communication. Sorry, little nit for me. But it's all about the comms team, right? So I really like the fact that you said, hey, you need to bring together a team that's diverse and represents different facets of the organization, I think, to have the best outcomes. So thank you for that. Prashant, anything else that you would add to that?
No, I think Peter nailed it. The word is accountability. Who's accountable, right? There are two things that are most important. The directive of doing the right thing has to come from the top, and it has to be cultural values. Do you want to do the right thing or not? Executive buy-in. I have seen in our customers some really good leaders, right? And they wanted to constitute a team, build this cross-functional team, and said, hey, all I need is engagement from these folks. But that buy-in from the top is not there. And so who is this new guy trying to make changes, trying to put this cross-functional team together? So now everybody else is paying lip service to it. Because you know what? Bad didn't happen. Here's one good news about bad things. They don't happen that often. If something happens often, we'll get your attention. Yeah. Right? We struggle with this. In all honesty, as a vendor, I struggle with this. Let's say I come to you with a product. $500,000. You'll do better when there is an active shooter in your building. Now you're sitting here. We talked about the ROI question here. $500,000 for active shooter. Now you're looking around saying, if I ask you, what's the cost of one life? Let me tell you, you will not answer that question. But everybody sitting in that budget team at the executive level say, $500,000 for this? They will not openly say. But if I ask them, do you think one employee is worth $500,000? Oh yeah, absolutely it is. Or will you pay that to a vendor? Well, right? So there has to be an executive buy-in along with everything that Peter said, right? So, and we face this challenge too, and we are very fortunate that we got it. I'm not trying to plug my company here, but we do have a risk intelligence team spread across the world. And fortunately, unfortunately, we have 4 of those analysts in Ukraine, right? And we knew exactly when the Polish border opened, and these 4 analysts were moved, and they're sitting right now in Poland, right? In an apartment that it's a big cottage, I would say. But that means, we were able to move with that speed because the executives right at the top had the right cultural values. They knew how to live it. And then they would put money where their mouth is. So that executive buy-in, along with great accountability and that cross-functional team that Peter talked about, I think is very essential. So challenge your leadership. How serious is this for you? From a cultural this is what you want, then this is what it'll cost.
Vanessa, anything else that you would add to that?
They nailed it.
Okay. Great. Could you talk a little bit about any examples that you've seen of companies that have made some mistakes in the area of crisis communication, and if you have any examples of what, or thoughts on what they might do to fix them?
Absolutely. Well, I'll start with my first example of when I failed. So a few years ago, I made a decision in my business that ended up costing us our annual revenue. Right, eyebrows go up. So think about the annual revenue of the companies that you're in. That's how bad my decision was. Terrible. I still work there. They didn't fire me. I don't have a board, thank God.
Not gonna fire now.
So, like most people, I made a mistake. I was embarrassed. I felt inadequate. And then I had to communicate my mistake because I have integrity. I didn't have to, but I did. And I had to talk about that mistake to a client, to my vendors and partners, and to my team. And it didn't feel good at all. And the first thing was admit that you were wrong, which ultimately communicated something in and of itself. And so with that in mind, I'll share with you a 2020 example of a phone call that I received from a client. So in 2020, we're all at home, great pandemic, isolated. Everybody's now clear on what a first responder is and why they're so important. And in May of 2020, George Floyd was murdered. So I really don't watch the news. My husband has to tell me what's going on so I can be prepared for when I talk to a client because it's just so depressing. But I ended up looking at the news. And there were over 60 protests in countries sustained for over 120 days. And it went from First Amendment rights being voiced as a protest. It went to civil unrest, and then it went to some people what some people might call as riots that happened across the country. And we have a client in retail who experienced the First Amendments to the protests, to the civil unrest, to the riots, and their properties were destroyed, merchandise taken, stolen, and damaged. And so what I saw as some mistakes were brands that were rushing to communicate a message. Going back to the data that was shown on that screen, how much people are impacted by the bottom line when people don't see where you stand on issues that are happening in our society. And this particular brand that I am referencing, their audio didn't match their video. Their core values conflicted with the core message. And it wasn't even the message that they put out there. It was the message behind the actions that were never even displayed. And so somebody reached out to me and said, hey, I want to write a letter on what happened with George Floyd and address it because my clients are asking me about it, which in their case are tenants. My employees are asking me about it, my board of directors, and other stakeholders. And we need to have a response. So they asked me to review the company's statement. And what I'll say is it is very important for us to have relationships and partnerships because when times like this happen, when you have to have real conversations, you need real relationships because it gives you the space and the longevity to have a conversation, but for people not to feel like you are attacking them. And so they asked me about this company's statement. So I read the statement, and then I went back to their website, and I looked at the core values. And their core values say, consider community first, seek the success of others, act fairly with integrity. Those are their 3 core values. And I went back to the letter that was drafted. And to be honest, it was weak. And the reason why they called me, because they didn't have any African-American vendors in their entire supply chain. At all. I was the only vendor who could speak to the situation and give them a level of confidence for what to do next. So they mentioned fluffy, soft language that was just unclear. And they talked about this D&I strategy that didn't exist. They talked about things in this statement, and my questions were, well, how are your employees going to hold you accountable for the words that you write on this screen? Are you prepared for the questions that are going to come back to you? There was no consideration for what happens after this documentation is put out there. What questions are we anticipating? Who's responsible? Who's accountable? How are we going to navigate this? There was no conversation, no thought behind that. And so when I was asked to share my recommendations with the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and this is an organization that most of you probably shop at, I asked him, what is the point behind this letter? What are you trying to accomplish? And why? And what I learned in that situation was we have to have the tough conversations. In full transparency, I didn't want to go to work that day. I didn't want to talk to them. And I was clear about that. I can't do it. Today's not the day because I'm not okay. I just saw someone get murdered and lynched on national TV, and it's business as usual. That's not acceptable. I came into that conversation in full transparency. I was okay to lose the business because holding you accountable for who you say you are was more important to me than to let you slide by and to put out an empty statement. And so in this scenario, the CEO didn't write the letter. He didn't have the words, the emotional intelligence, or the care to come up with what those words meant. And so I told him, if you can't come up with these words on your own, and if your heart doesn't ring and you can't feel for the people who shop at your centers, for your tenants, then don't put out a statement. And if you're not going to hold somebody in this company accountable for the words that you put out there, then you don't need to write a statement. Just say nothing. It's better than putting something out there and you being inconsistent. So that's a mistake that I see, and specific to the conversation on racial justice and equity, going back to the data again, people are looking for reality with brands. And I think that we have to be in a situation where we get to a place where we're asking the tough questions. I am a vendor partner. It's a financial risk for me to ask you that question because you may not want to do business with me. But for the integrity that I hold in my career and for all the work that I put into what I know and how to leverage that, I owe it to you to tell you the truth. And shame on you for hiring somebody and you don't want to hear the truth. Shame on them for hiring you and putting you in roles if you are not empowered to speak truth. And so I think we have to get out of this place of I'm uncomfortable. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's unrealistic to think that you're not going to be uncomfortable. We owe it to these companies because it's showing up. It's on social media, and our world is not happy. And so those are mistakes that I think we've got to get better at addressing and helping companies with.
Vanessa, thank you so much for your vulnerability and also sharing your recommendations with the entire audience. Very powerful. Thank you. I know that we're almost down to 7 minutes, and we're standing between lunch, which is never a great position to be in, or right after lunch, right? So I want to ask the panel, do we want to try to take some questions from the audience before we wrap up today? Okay.
Are there questions?
Do we have any questions that have come in, or do we have any questions from the audience for our panelists? No?
No questions yet.
All right. Do we want to just wrap up with our last question right now, which is, I just want to skip to duty of care because I think that's something out there that's being discussed and how we do that appropriately. So I wanted to ask Prashant to take that first as our wrap-up question. Any recommendations you have on duty to care and any examples of what you've seen done well or where you think we could improve?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think Vanessa said it brilliantly. It starts from the top. When I talk about accountability and culture, do you really care? And that's why I have a subtle problem with the word duty of care. I think it should be duty to care. I really think, I hope the industry changes this. My slides, every time I talk about it, I said duty of care. No, duty to care, right? And that changes your approach because it creates as a bias for action. Do something about it. But I also think we need to change the conversation from the concept of a disaster recovery, right? The example Vanessa gave is the disaster occurred, and now you're trying to recover. If you had the right cultural values to begin with when there was no disaster, you become organizationally resilient. Resilience is your ability to withstand that stress and recover gracefully. You don't have to break, right? Bad things will happen and it will stress your organization. Can you gracefully recover? And that's, I think, to me, a subtle difference between duty of care and duty to care. Duty to care is proactive. I care for you every day. It is my duty to care. Duty of care is, oh, when something bad happens, what are the 5 things I'm supposed to do to be compliant? So OSHA doesn't come after me. Privacy regulations are not violated. Labor laws are respected. That is called duty of care. Duty to care is a way of living. So that's why I do have a subtle problem with that industry term called duty of care. But organizational resilience is duty to care. You care about your people, care about your assets, your infrastructure, your brand, and all the elements that Peter, Vanessa are talking about lead to this concept of, are you organizationally resilient? Which means, can you challenge your culture? Can you challenge your people? Can you challenge your processes? Can you challenge your technology? And will it gracefully recover from any challenge that comes its way? That's resilience. That to me is duty to care.
Peter, anything else from you in this area? Any thoughts that you might want to share?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about just the history of duty of care and duty to care, which I love that phrase. I'm going to start using that. I'm stealing it. 25 years ago, it barely existed. It was put some fire alarms in the building and maybe have a PA system, and that was it. But things have changed dramatically since then. There's a whole bunch of reasons for it. It's just expectations in general. It's these devices that we have with us 24/7, the expectation that we know what's going on all the time and someone's communicating with us. And if you don't, I'll go out to social media and try to figure it out. So we're kind of forced into over-communicating with people now, whereas in the past we didn't. But what's really interesting now is this term that you've all heard, the Great Resignation, and like what is causing people to leave organizations. So Alert Media actually recently commissioned a study. We interviewed over 2,000 people across all categories and found out how important is employee safety to you. And the results were pretty staggering. And there's many things that contribute to people leaving organizations, but this is definitely one of them, people not feeling safe at work. So I do have a session later. If you can't make it, that's totally fine. We published the full report. You can get it on our website. But I think it's fantastic evidence that you guys can use as you go back into your organizations to explain to management why duty to care is so important and it's worth investing in. Not spending money on, but actually investing in. It's going to help with employee retention.
Thank you for that. Just in closing, is there anything else, any other thoughts that you guys want to share with this group? No?
I think we said everything we had to say. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for being here.
All right. Great, guys. Thank you so much for the engagement, and thank you so much to our panelists. Please can we give them a round of applause?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right. So before you break, please feel free to go ahead and access the app and comment about today's session. Lunch will be from about 12:45-ish in the exhibit hall. Breakouts will run today between 12:45 and 4:30. There will be a refreshment break, and also the reception this evening is from 6:30 to 8:30 in the Casitas courtyard. You can go ahead and head to the exhibit hall. We'll have raffle tickets at 3 o'clock, and visit DRJ booth 104 for a list of winners to claim your prize. See you guys tomorrow morning.